Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we step quietly into a medieval winter camp somewhere in Europe many centuries ago, where the night air is so cold that every breath turns instantly into pale mist. The firelight flickers across rows of rough tents and wooden wagons, and the ground beneath your boots is stiff with frost. Somewhere nearby a horse snorts softly while a soldier coughs into his cloak. It is the kind of cold that creeps slowly into your bones and settles there like an unwelcome guest. You probably will not survive this. Well, at least not comfortably, because medieval soldiers did not have insulated sleeping bags, heated tents, or cozy electric blankets. Instead, they faced winter nights armed mostly with wool fire and stubborn determination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, let me know where in the world you are listening from and what your local time is right now. Now dim the lights. You stand near the edge of the camp, watching the slow rhythm of evening settle in. The last colours of sunset fade behind distant hills, leaving the sky a deep, quiet blue. Soldiers move through the camp in a steady routine that has clearly been repeated many times before. Someone feeds another log into the fire. Someone else shakes snow from a wool cloak. A pair of men drag a bundle of straw toward a tent. The entire camp seems to understand something very important. If you want to survive the night, you prepare before the cold truly arrives. A widely accepted historical understanding is that medieval armies often camped outdoors during campaigns, even in harsh winter conditions, relying on simple shelters, fires, and layered clothing rather than permanent structures. Winter warfare was unpleasant, but it was far from rare. Armies marched in cold seasons more often than people might imagine. You rub your hands together slowly, feeling the sting of the air. Even through gloves, the cold finds its way in. Nearby, a group of soldiers crouches round a fire pit dug shallowly into the frozen ground. The flames burn low and steady, carefully tended. Too large a fire wastes precious wood. Too small a fire risks freezing. Fire in this place is life. The warmth spreads outward only a short distance, just enough for a few men to sit comfortably in a rough circle. Their cloaks drape around them like thick curtains, trapping every bit of heat they can. One man stretches his boots toward the flames, while carefully rotating them, trying to dry damp leather without burning it. Another soldier holds his hands over the heat, sighing softly, as warmth trickles back into his fingers. It is not luxury, but compared to the open winter air, it feels almost comfortable. The camp smells of wood smoke, damp wool, and something faintly meaty simmering somewhere deeper among the tents. Your nose picks up hints of ash and leather. It is not unpleasant, exactly just heavy and earthy. A curious little historical detail sometimes mentioned in medieval chronicles is that soldiers often became extremely skilled at building efficient campfires. Some veterans could judge the right size of a fire simply by feeling the wind and testing the dryness of nearby branches. Too much smoke might reveal a camp's position to enemies, while too little heat risked long sleepless nights. So the fire pits are carefully placed, often shielded by small earthen walls or wagon wheels to block the wind. You take a few slow steps through the camp. Snow crunches underfoot. That sound becomes the quiet background music of winter armies. A soldier passes you carrying a bundle of firewood balanced against his shoulder. Another kneels beside a horse, rubbing the animal's neck with a cloth to keep frost from forming on the harness. Everyone works with calm efficiency. Nobody rushes, but nobody wastes time either. Winter nights are long. Preparation is survival. Scholars still debate how well organized medieval winter camps truly were. Some historians believe that professional armies maintained relatively orderly encampments with planned fire areas and sleeping zones. Others suggest that many camps were far more chaotic, with soldiers improvising their own solutions wherever space allowed. Standing here in the fading light, you can imagine either possibility being true. Some parts of the camp appear tidy and structured. Others look like clusters of exhausted men who simply dropped their gear where they stood. The wind drifts across the field again, carrying a colder gust this time. It slips under your cloak and across your neck. You instinctively pull the fabric tighter. Across the camp, a large iron pot hangs over another fire. Steam rises into the darkening air as someone stirs the contents with a wooden ladle. The smell reaches you slowly: barley, herbs, maybe bits of salted meat. It's not fancy food, but in freezing weather it becomes something far more valuable than taste. Warmth from the inside. A slightly unusual fact preserved in a few medieval accounts notes that soldiers sometimes believed hot soups or broths could push back the cold spirits that lived in winter winds. While we might smile at the superstition today, the basic idea actually had practical value. Hot liquids help raise body temperature and provide calories needed to maintain warmth. The soldiers probably did not know the science, they simply knew it worked. The sky above the camp deepens into darkness now. A few early stars appear glittering sharply in the clear winter air. Cold nights often bring the brightest skies. Somewhere beyond the fires, a guard calls quietly to another sentry. The words drift through the darkness in a low voice, almost like a ritual. Soldiers on watch change positions, slowly stamping their boots to keep blood moving through their feet. Even standing still too long can become dangerous in this. You walk past another fire circle where several men are already wrapping themselves tightly in thick cloaks. One soldier lies back against a bundle of straw, pulling his hood forward until only his nose remains visible. Another man carefully places a heated stone near his feet inside the blanket. That small trick might keep him comfortable for an hour or two, maybe longer, and in a winter camp, a few hours of warmth can feel like a miracle. The fires crackle softly around you. The camp settles. Wood pops in the flames. Horses shift their weight. Somewhere a soldier hums a quiet tune that drifts briefly through the cold air before fading away. You find a place near one of the fires and settle down among the others. Your cloak wraps around your shoulders. The warmth of the flames touches your hands. Above you the stars slowly brighten, and all around medieval soldiers prepare to face another long, freezing night. The fire beside you burns low and steady, its glow reflecting faintly across metal helmets and shield rims stacked near the tents. Around you soldiers adjust their cloaks and settle deeper into the small comfort the flames provide. The warmth reaches only a few feet before surrendering again to the sharp bite of winter air. You notice something interesting as the men shift and move. Armor is not the first layer touching their skin. In fact, most of what keeps them warm tonight cannot be seen at all. Beneath the gleaming steel of helmets and breastplates, beneath belts and straps and padded shoulders, there exists a quiet world of fabric. Wool, linen, thick stitch padding, layer upon layer of simple material working quietly to hold heat close to the body. You pull your cloak closer and imagine what lies under the armor of the soldier sitting beside you. First comes a linen shirt, soft against the skin and designed to absorb sweat. Over that might sit a thicker wool tunic. Then, depending on the soldier's equipment, a padded garment known as a gambeson. Only after those layers would the metal armor finally rest on top. A well-accepted historical observation is that medieval soldiers rarely wore armor directly against bare skin. Doing so would be painfully cold in winter and dangerously hot in summer. Fabric layers provided both insulation and protection from chafing caused by heavy metal plates or chainmail. So even before fire or blankets come into the picture, the soldier's first defense against winter already surrounds him. The wind drifts through camp, again rattling the edge of a nearby tent. One of the men by the fire leans forward and tugs his cloak tighter around his shoulders. The garment looks heavy and slightly rough, its wool surface thick enough to trap tiny pockets of warm air. You run your hand across your own cloak and feel the texture. Wool is not soft like modern fleece, but it has a remarkable quality. Even when damp, it can still retain warmth. That property alone made wool one of the most valuable materials of the medieval world. Some historians point out that large sections of the medieval economy revolved around wool production. Entire regions raised sheep primarily to supply armies, merchants, and towns with the thick fibers needed for clothing, blankets, and cloaks. Tonight in this winter camp you see way the soldiers sitting around you depend on wool almost as much as they depend on fire. A man across the flames stretches his arms and rolls his shoulders slowly. The faint metallic clink reveals chainmail beneath his outer layers. Under the flicker of firelight, the small interlocking rings shimmer like dark silver scales. Chainmail may look cold and unforgiving, but it rarely touches skin directly. Beneath it sits padding that cushions blows and traps warmth. Some gambesons were stitched so thickly that they resembled quilted jackets. Layers of linen or wool were sewn together in tight patterns, creating pockets that held warm air close to the body. A curious tidbit found in several medieval records suggests that in some cases heavily padded gambesons could stop arrows or absorb sword strikes even without metal armour. This made them useful not only for warmth but also as a form of protection for poorer soldiers who could not afford steel. So that bulky padded jacket was doing double duty, keeping you warm and keeping you alive. You glance toward another group of soldiers preparing for sleep. One man carefully removes his helmet and shakes out his hair before pulling a thick wool cap down over his ears. Another loosens the leather straps of his armour, but leaves the padded underlayer firmly in place. Nobody removes too many layers. The cold would make that a mistake. Historians still argue whether soldiers typically slept wearing portions of their armour or removed it entirely during winter nights. Some written accounts suggest that men kept at least their padded garments on at all times, while armour might be loosened but not fully discarded in case of sudden alarms. Standing half-dressed in freezing temperatures while scrambling into armour would be a miserable task, so most soldiers preferred to stay at least partially ready. You feel the ground beneath you still stiff with frost even near the fire. That cold creeps upward slowly through boots and knees. It reminds you that warmth must come from many directions at once. Clothing alone cannot do everything, but it certainly helps. Nearby, a soldier lifts his sleeve and examines the inner stitching of his garment under the firelight. The fabric shows thick quilted seams running in straight lines from shoulder to wrist. Those seams are not decorative. They hold layers of material tightly together, preventing the padding from shifting during movement or battle. You realize that medieval clothing, especially for soldiers, was often far more engineered than people assume today. Every stitch served a purpose. The wind quiets for a moment and the camp grows almost peaceful. Crackling firewood becomes the loudest sound. Sparks drift upward and vanish into the dark sky. A man beside you slowly pulls a wool blanket across his lap. The fabric looks worn from years of use, its edges frayed but still sturdy. He folds it carefully around his legs, sealing in warmth. Even something as simple as that blanket represents hours of labour. Sheep raised, wool sheared, fibres cleaned, spun, woven and sewn. All so that tonight, in the middle of a frozen field, a soldier might sleep without shivering uncontrollably. Across the fire circle, another soldier begins rubbing his arms briskly through his padded sleeves. Blood circulation becomes important when temperatures drop. Movement helps. Even small motions, flexing fingers, rolling shoulders, stamping boots lightly against the ground. You notice how often the soldiers do this without thinking. The body learns quickly when survival depends on it. From somewhere deeper in camp comes the sound of laughter, a brief moment of warmth that has nothing to do with fire or wool. Human company helps too, but the practical layers remain the first line of defence. Linen closest to the skin, wool above that, thick padding to trap heat, cloaks wrapped tightly around the outside, layer after layer quietly working together. You lean closer to the fire and feel its warmth against your hands again. And beneath your cloak, beneath the fabric and stitching your own body slowly gathers its heat, just like the soldiers around you, preparing to endure another long winter night. The fire has settled into a slow, steady burn now, its orange glow spreading gently across the frozen ground. Around you, the camp grows quieter as more soldiers begin preparing for sleep. Cloaks tighten helmets are set aside and small piles of straw appear beside bedrolls. Yet one particular garment keeps appearing wherever you look. It sits beneath armour. It peeks out beneath cloaks. It forms the thick padded shape around shoulders and arms. The gambeson. You watch a soldier across the fire loosen the leather straps of his breastplate and carefully lift the metal piece over his head. The steel catches the firelight briefly before he sets it down beside him. What remains is a bulky quilted jacket that looks almost like something a traveller might wear on a cold mountain road. The gambeson is thick, stitched and slightly worn. Its surface carries rows of tight seams running vertically across the chest and arms. Inside those seams sit layers of linen, wool, or sometimes scraps of fabric stitched together to create padding. A widely accepted understanding among historians is that gambesons were one of the most common protective garments worn by medieval soldiers. They served as armour padding under chainmail or plate armour, but they also functioned as standalone protection for poorer infantry who could not afford expensive metal equipment. Tonight, though, its most important job is something far simpler: keeping the cold away. The soldier stretches his arms, slowly testing the flexibility of the padded garment. The gambeson looks heavy, but it allows enough movement for swinging weapons, climbing ladders, or marching long distances. And most importantly, it traps warmth. Air becomes the secret ingredient. The many layers of cloth create tiny pockets where warm air from the body gathers and stays close to the skin. The thicker the padding, the longer that warmth remains. You shift your position slightly and feel the chill rising through the ground again. Even with fire nearby, the frozen earth never truly stops being cold. That is why soldiers keep their gambesons on through the night. Removing it would mean losing one of the most reliable sources of insulation they have. Across the fire, another man pulls his gambeson sleeves further down his wrists before wrapping his cloak around his shoulders. The combination looks almost bulky, but the soldiers seem used to the feeling. Warmth is worth the extra weight. You reach out towards the flames and listen to the quiet sounds of the camp. Wood cracks softly. Horses shuffle somewhere beyond the tents. A few soldiers murmur to one another in low voices. The night is deepening. Winter nights stretch for many hours, and the temperature often drops further after midnight. The soldiers know this from experience. What feels merely cold now may feel bitterly freezing later, so they prepare early. One interesting detail occasionally mentioned in medieval military records is that gambesons were sometimes stuffed with unusual materials when fabric was scarce. Bits of old cloth wool scraps, horsehair, or even dried grass could be used to fill the padding layers. While not luxurious, these improvised filling still help trap air and create insulation. In other words, medieval soldiers practiced a kind of early insulation engineering without ever calling it that. The concept was simple. More trapped air meant more warmth. You glance toward another fire circle nearby. A young soldier sits there slowly repairing the seam of his gambeson with needle and thread. His fingers move carefully despite the cold, pushing the needle through thick layers of cloth. He works close to the fire so the light allows him to see. Each stitch matters. A torn seam could allow the padding to shift or bunch up, reducing its ability to trap heat properly. In winter conditions like these, even small repairs become important. The man finishes the stitch and ties the thread with a satisfied nod before pulling the garment tighter around his body again. The wind drifts softly across the camp, stirring sparks from the fire. The cold air slips along the edges of cloaks and through small openings in the tents. Yet the soldiers remain relatively calm. They know that their gambesons will help hold the warmth they have already built up. Historians still argue whether gambesons were originally designed mainly for armour protection or for comfort and insulation during long campaigns. Some scholars believe their protective function came first, while others suggest that soldiers valued them just as much for warmth and shock absorption during long marches. Standing here tonight, the answer feels obvious. The gambeson does both. It protects, it insulates, and it allows a soldier to sleep through a freezing night with at least a little comfort. You notice one older soldier settling down beside the fire. Instead of lying flat on the ground, he leans against a rolled bundle of straw and pulls his cloak tightly over his padded jacket. The gambeson underneath forms a soft barrier between his body and the cold air. It looks almost like a medieval sleeping jacket. Another soldier lies on his side nearby, resting his head on a folded cloak. His gambeson creases slightly at the shoulders as he relaxes. The garment holds its shape thick and sturdy. Despite its rugged appearance, it almost resembles a quilt. A quilt you can wear into battle. The fire burns steadily as the sky above grows darker. Stars shine sharply in the clear winter air. Somewhere beyond the camp, an owl calls softly from a distant tree. You breathe slowly and feel the warmth gathered beneath your own layers. Cloth against skin, padding holding heat, cloak sealing the warmth inside. A medieval soldier may not have modern winter gear, but he carries something just as practical. A thick padded gambeson stitched with patience and necessity. And tonight, as the cold deepens across the sleeping camp, that simple quilted jacket becomes one of the quiet heroes of survival. The fire beside you fades slightly as another log settles into glowing embers. A soldier nearby leans forward and nudges the wood with a stick, sending a brief swirl of sparks into the dark air. Around the camp, the sounds of movement grow softer. One by one, men begin settling into places where they hope to sleep for a few hours before morning. The cold deepens. You notice a horse standing only a few steps away, its large shape outlined against the faint firelight. Its breath rises in steady clouds drifting upward into the night. The animal shifts its weight slowly and lowers its head toward a small pile of hay. The warmth coming from its body is almost visible. A man wrapped in a thick cloak walks toward the horse and rests a hand against its neck. He stands there quietly for a moment, letting the heat of the animal pass through his gloves. You realize that in this frozen camp, horses are more than transport. They are moving furnaces! Medieval military records often mention the enormous number of animals travelling with armies. Horses pulled wagons, carried knights, hauled supplies, and served as essential companions throughout campaigns. During winter, their presence provided an unexpected advantage. Large animals produce a surprising amount of body heat. Stand close enough and you can feel it. You step closer and sense the warmth radiating gently through the cold air. It is subtle but noticeable, like standing near a low fire. There's a fire. Flickers. The soldier beside the horse seems to understand this well. He pulls his cloak tighter and settles onto a small bundle of straw at the animal's side. The horse barely reacts. It simply continues chewing hay, occasionally flicking its ears. An unusual little detail preserved in a few campaign descriptions suggests that some soldiers intentionally slept near their horses during freezing nights. The animal's body heat combined with a cloak and padding could raise the temperature just enough to make sleep possible. It might not sound glamorous, but in the middle of a winter field, survival rarely looks glamorous. You watch as another soldier joins the first. He spreads a blanket on the ground beside the horse, positioning himself so that the animal blocks part of the wind. The large body forms a natural wall against the drifting air. Wind is often worse than cold itself. Even a weak breeze can carry away the small pockets of warmth trapped beneath clothing and blankets. Soldiers quickly learn to use anything available to break that flow of air. Wagons, shields, bundles of gear, or horses. The man settles down and pulls his cloak up to his chin. The horse shifts slightly but remains calm. Clearly this arrangement has happened before. Animals that travel with armies grow accustomed to strange nighttime habits. You glance across the camp and notice that this is not the only place where soldiers gather near animals. Several horses stand in loose groups, and in a few spots men sit or lie nearby. Some lean against saddles, others sit quietly with their backs against the animal's sides. There is something oddly peaceful about the scene. Horses breathe slowly and rhythmically, their warm breath rising like faint clouds in the starlight. Their presence adds a sense of quiet companionship to the camp. Researchers who study medieval logistics often point out that armies depended heavily on horses not just for battle, but for everyday survival. Without them, supplies could not move, wounded soldiers could not be transported, and long marches would become nearly impossible. In winter, their usefulness extended even further. They carried warmth. Of course, this arrangement was not always perfect. Sleeping beside a horse comes with certain risks. The animals are large and sometimes restless. A sudden movement could knock over a sleeping soldier or step dangerously close to someone's blanket. Because of that, soldiers tended to rest near calm, trained animals rather than young or nervous ones. You hear the soft jingle of harness rings as one horse shifts again. The sound is gentle, almost soothing. The animal lowers itself, slightly bending one hind leg as it relaxes. The two soldiers beside it pull their cloaks tighter and settle deeper into their bedding. Their shoulders relax. Even a small increase in warmth can make the difference between shivering and sleeping. Some modern historians continue to examine how frequently soldiers relied on animal heat in winter camps. Written evidence appears occasionally, but it is not always detailed. Many everyday survival habits simply went unrecorded because they were so ordinary to the people living them. Still, when you stand here in the middle of this quiet camp, the idea feels completely logical. If warmth exists nearby, you use it. The night grows darker now, and the sky fills with more stars. The air becomes sharper with every passing hour. Frost begins forming along the edges of saddles and wagon wheels. Your breath rises slowly as you watch the men settle down beside the horses. The camp has changed. Earlier, it was full of movement and preparation. Now it enters a quieter phase. Fires burn low, cloaks rustle softly. Horses breathe steadily. A soldier near you stretches out his legs and rests his boots against the warm side of a horse's belly. He sighs quietly, clearly appreciating the heat. You feel the cold again against your own boots and understand immediately why he chose that spot. A living animal radiates warmth in a way no blanket can match. Nearby, another soldier sits upright for a moment, rubbing his hands together, before tucking them beneath his arms. His gambeson creases as he leans forward, trapping the warmth inside his clothing. All the little survival strategies of the night begin working together. Layered clothing, low campfires, straw bedding, and occasionally the quiet warmth of a horse standing patiently in the dark. You settle yourself near the fire again, watching the silhouettes of animals and soldiers blend together in the dim glow. The cold still rules the night, but the soldiers are not entirely helpless against it. They borrow warmth wherever they can find it, even from the steady breathing of a horse beside them. The night has settled fully across the camp now. The last traces of twilight disappeared long ago, leaving only the pale shimmer of stars and the warm flicker of scattered fires. From where you sit, the camp looks like a small constellation of glowing embers spread across the frozen field. Fire is the center of everything. You shift closer to the flames, feeling their warmth against your hands and face. The heat is not overwhelming. It is gentle, steady, and deeply welcome. Around you, soldiers sit in small circles, their cloaks wrapped tightly, while sparks drift upward into the darkness. Every fire in this camp has been built with careful attention. A number of medieval chronicles describe how armies relied heavily on controlled campfires during winter campaigns. Fires were not simply thrown together from random wood. Soldiers often dug shallow pits or built small barriers around the flames to protect them from wind and to keep heat concentrated where it was needed most. You notice that the fire beside you sits inside a shallow hollow scraped into the frozen ground. A ring of stones surrounds the embers. The stones absorb heat, slowly storing warmth that will continue radiating even as the flames begin to shrink. A soldier crouched nearby pushes another piece of wood into the center with the end of a stick. He does it slowly and carefully, avoiding any sudden burst of sparks. Too much flaking would waste fuel. Wood is valuable during winter campaigns. Armies traveling through forests could gather branches easily enough, but on open plains or frozen fields the supply could become scarce. Soldiers learn to stretch every piece of firewood as long as possible. You watch as the man arranges the logs in a tight triangular pattern. The flames respond immediately, growing stronger while still staying compact. It is a small lesson in quiet engineering. An interesting detail found in several period accounts reveals that experienced soldiers often became quite skilled at building efficient fires that burned long and steady rather than tall and fast. This allowed them to conserve wood while maintaining a reliable source of warmth throughout the night. Efficiency matters when hundreds or even thousands of men depend on the same limited supply of fuel. Across the camp you see another fire circle, where several soldiers have arranged shields upright around the flames. The curved surfaces form a crude wall that reflects heat back toward the men sitting nearby. You can feel the difference even from a short distance. The warmth seems trapped inside that little space, creating a pocket of comfort in the cold air. This trick appears in multiple historical descriptions of medieval encampments. Shields, wagon sides, and even stacks of equipment were sometimes arranged to redirect heat and block wind. Improvisation becomes an art when winter arrives. You rub your hands together slowly, letting the warmth seep back into your fingers. The skin tingles slightly as circulation returns. Across the fire, a soldier lifts a small iron pot and sets it carefully among the coals. Steam begins to rise almost immediately. Something warm is coming. The smell drifts toward you gradually. Herbs broth, perhaps a few pieces of salted meat. Even before the food is ready, the scent itself seems comforting. Heat from food and drink matters just as much as fire. Many historical observers note that soldiers relied heavily on warm meals during cold campaigns. A hot stew or broth could provide calories, moisture and warmth all at once. It also gave men a reason to gather close together. You notice how naturally the soldiers form circles around the flames. Nobody sits far away if they can help it. Cloaks overlap slightly, boots stretch toward the heat. This is not only about warmth. There is safety in numbers as well. Cold weather can become dangerous surprisingly quickly. Sitting close together allows soldiers to notice if someone begins shivering too violently or growing too quiet. A few soldiers extend their hands toward the flames, while others rest their boots near the outer edge of the fire pit. The soles of their footwear slowly dry as faint steam rises from damp leather. Moisture is another enemy during winter. Wet boots and socks draw heat away from the body faster than almost anything else. Keeping footwear dry becomes a nightly task. Some researchers who study medieval military life continue to discuss how organized these fire circles truly were. Certain sources suggest that experienced armies arranged fires in planned patterns across the camp, while others indicate that smaller groups of soldiers simply built fires wherever they found space. Looking around this camp, you see a mixture of both ideas. Some fires appear carefully spaced. Others seem more spontaneous, surrounded by whatever soldiers happened to be nearby when the wood was gathered. The wind rises briefly again, carrying sparks sideways through the air. A soldier quickly adjusts the shield wall around his fire, preventing the breeze from scattering the embers. Even small gusts can cause trouble if sparks reach dry cloth or straw. Fire keeps the soldiers alive, but it must also be respected. You lean back slightly, letting the warmth settle across your chest. The firelight flickers across helmets resting beside bedrolls. Shadows move gently across the canvas walls of nearby tents. Some soldiers have already fallen asleep near the flames. Others remain awake, talking quietly or simply staring into the glowing coals. The camp feels almost peaceful now. You hear the soft bubbling of the stew pot as it warms in the fire. One of the soldiers lifts the lid briefly, allowing a cloud of fragrant steam to escape. Several men lean closer immediately. Warm food is never ignored during winter. You stretch your legs toward the fire and watch the embers shift and glow. The stones surrounding the pit now radiate a gentle warmth of their own. It's not the blazing heat of a large bonfire, but it does not need to be. The goal is steady warmth that lasts through the long hours of darkness. Around you, dozens of similar fires burn quietly across the camp. Small circles of heat, tiny islands of comfort, each one helping medieval soldiers endure the freezing night. The stew pot near the fire has begun to empty, and the soldiers around you slowly settle into quieter positions. The brief excitement of warm food fades into the deeper rhythm of the night. One man wipes the inside of his wooden bowl with a piece of bread before tucking it away inside his pack. Another shakes crumbs from his cloak and pulls the fabric higher around his shoulders. Cloaks now become the most visible armor against the cold. You notice them everywhere. Thick folds of wool draped across shoulders, long edges wrapped around legs, hoods pulled forward until only eyes and noses remain visible. In the dim firelight, the soldiers almost resemble dark moving shapes of fabric more than people. Cloaks were one of the most essential pieces of clothing a medieval traveller or soldier owned. Written sources from the period frequently describe heavy wool cloaks designed to serve many purposes at once. They provided warmth during travel, protection from rain or snow, and even temporary bedding during the night. A cloak was not simply clothing, it was portable shelter. You watch as a soldier stands and shakes out his cloak before wrapping it carefully around his body again. The garment falls almost to his calves, forming a thick curtain against the wind. When he pulls the hood forward, the wool frames his face like a small cave of warmth. Only a narrow opening remains for breathing. You try the same motion with your own cloak, pulling the edges inward across your chest. The difference is immediate. The cold air loses its easy path toward your skin. Your body heat remains trapped inside the folds of cloth. It's a simple trick, yet extremely effective. One commonly noted feature of medieval wool cloaks is their density. The wool fibers were often tightly woven and then slightly felted, meaning the surface became thicker and more resistant to wind. Even without modern waterproof coatings, such cloaks could block a surprising amount of cold air. That matters greatly on a night like this. The wind moves across the open field, again sliding along the edges of tents and wagons. When it meets the heavy wool cloaks wrapped around the soldiers, much of that cold is stopped. Across the fire circle, a soldier spreads his cloak flat on the ground before sitting on it. The thick fabric forms a barrier between his body and the frozen earth. Once seated, he pulls the remaining half up around his shoulder again. The cloak becomes both seat and blanket at once. An unusual little habit occasionally mentioned in travel accounts is that some medieval cloaks included small metal clasps or brooches at the collar. These allowed the wearer to fasten the cloak securely around the neck, freeing the hands while still keeping the garment wrapped tightly against the body. You notice several soldiers using such clasps now. The small pieces of metal glint briefly in the firelight before disappearing again beneath layers of wool. With the cloak fastened, a soldier can walk, cook, or tend the fire without constantly holding the fabric closed. Practical design quietly improves survival. You glance toward the darker edge of the camp where a few soldiers prepare their bedding. One man spreads a bundle of straw across the ground, then carefully lays his cloak over the top. The straw creates insulation from below while the cloak traps warmth above. Another soldier nearby pulls two cloaks together, layering them to create an even thicker covering. The fabric looks heavy, but weight becomes a small price for warmth. Winter nights do not reward minimal clothing. Researchers studying medieval clothing sometimes point out that wool cloaks varied greatly depending on a soldier's wealth or origin. A knight or noble might own a cloak lined with fur, while a common infantryman relied on plain wool that had been worn and repaired many times. You can see both types here. One soldier near the fire wears a cloak trimmed with pale fur along the collar. The fur catches the firelight softly, forming a pale halo around his shoulders. Beside him, another man wraps himself in a darker cloak that shows patches where fabric has been repaired. Despite the difference in appearance, both garments serve the same essential purpose. Holding warmth close, you notice a soldier sitting quietly near the edge of the firelight with his cloak pulled completely around his body. Only his boots extended from the fabric. From a distance, he almost resembles a bundled sack resting on the ground. Occasionally he shifts slightly, adjusting the folds to seal any gaps where cold air might sneak inside. Cloaks encourage creativity. The soldiers fold them, roll them, spread them, or wrap them in countless different ways depending on the situation. Sometimes a cloak becomes a pillow. Sometimes it becomes a blanket. Sometimes it forms a small tent of fabric shielding a sleeping soldier from drifting snow. Across the camp, a man lifts the edge of his cloak and holds it toward the fire for a moment. The wool warms quickly. When he wraps it around his shoulders again, the heat lingers inside the cloth. It is a small luxury. But small luxuries matter on freezing nights. Experts who examine medieval military equipment often emphasize how versatile cloaks were during campaigns. Unlike armor or weapons, cloaks could be used constantly throughout the day and night. They protected soldiers while marching, riding, resting, and sleeping. Few items in a medieval soldier's pack offered so many uses. The wind softens again and the camp grows still. Firelight flickers across rows of cloaked figures settling into sleep. Some lean against saddles or bundles of gear. Others lie flat on straw beds wrapped tightly in fabric. The cloaks rise and fall slowly with each breath. You pull your own cloak tighter and lean closer to the fire. The warmth inside the wool feels steady now, like a quiet shield surrounding your body. The cold still waits outside. But for the moment, the thick folds of cloth hold it back. And in this medieval winter camp, a simple wool cloak becomes one of the most reliable companions a soldier can have. The fire has burned lower. Now its bright flames settling into a bed of glowing coals. The warmth still spreads outward, though more gently than before. Around you, the soldiers begin shifting from sitting to sleeping. Cloaks rustle, boots scrape softly against frozen ground. Somewhere a man sighs deeply as he lowers himself onto a pile of straw. The camp grows quieter with each passing minute. You notice that many of the soldiers are not sleeping alone. Instead, they lie close together, shoulders nearly touching blankets, overlapping like the scales of a giant woolen creature stretched across the earth. At first glance, it might seem uncomfortable, but here in the freezing night, closeness is a form of warmth. The body naturally produces heat. One person alone can preserve only a small bubble of that warmth beneath a cloak. Several people together create a larger pocket of shared heat that lingers much longer. You see this clearly near one of the tents. 3 soldiers lie side by side beneath overlapping cloaks, their shoulders pressed together. One man has tucked his hands under his arms, while another pulls his hood forward so only his nose and beard remain visible. They look almost like a row of bundled travellers waiting for a winter carriage. Yet the arrangement is deliberate. Written descriptions from medieval military life frequently mention soldiers sharing sleeping spaces during cold campaigns. Tents were often crowded, and even when men slept outdoors, they tended to lie close together to reduce exposure to wind and preserve warmth. The idea is simple. Several warm bodies create a warmer space than one. You move a little closer to the group and notice how their cloaks are arranged. Each man has wrapped his own cloak tightly around himself, but the outer edges overlap with the others. This creates a layered barrier against the cold air creeping across the ground. A blanket alone might trap warmth. Several blankets overlapping can trap much more. A soldier at the edge of the group adjusts his position slightly, tucking his boots beneath the shared edge of a cloak. He exhales slowly, sending a small cloud of breath into the dark air. Moments later, his breathing becomes slower. Sleep arrives quickly when the body finally finds warmth. Across the camp, another cluster of soldiers forms a similar arrangement beside a wagon. They lean against the wooden wheel and wrap their cloaks around each other's shoulders. The wagon itself blocks part of the wind while the shared blankets hold in the heat. Improvisation becomes instinct during winter campaigns. One curious observation occasionally mentioned in travel writings from the Middle Ages describes how soldiers sometimes joked about sleeping like spoons in a drawer during especially cold nights. The comparison is surprisingly accurate. Bodies lined up side by side, curved slightly inward, creating a long chain of warmth beneath shared coverings. It may not have been elegant, but it worked. You watch one of the soldiers shift slightly and pull the cloak higher over the group. The fabric settles like a roof above their shoulders. Even a small gap could allow cold air to slip inside. That is why they adjust constantly. You feel the cold ground beneath your boots and understand immediately why they prefer to lie together. The frozen earth pulls warmth downwards, slowly draining heat from any body resting directly on it. When several soldiers lie together, they reduce the amount of exposed surface touching the ground. Less heat escapes. Across the fire circle, 2 men prepare their bedding beside a pile of straw. Instead of spreading the straw widely, they push it into a single thick mound and lie on top together. The straw forms a shared mattress. You notice that one soldier drapes his cloak across both of them while the other pulls a blanket across their legs. Layers of cloth and layers of people combine to create a small island of warmth in the freezing darkness. Some modern researchers studying medieval encampments suggest that crowded sleeping arrangements may have been as much about necessity as comfort. Supplies of blankets were often limited, and sharing resources allowed more soldiers to stay warm through the night. In other words, cooperation helped everyone survive. The wind drifts through the camp again, but the groups of sleeping soldiers barely react. Their shared cloaks and close position hold the warmth in ad. Only the occasional movement of a shoulder or boot disturbs the stillness. You sit quietly beside the fire and listen. Soft breathing, crackling embers, the distant sound of a horse shifting its weight. The camp feels almost peaceful now. Earlier in the evening, there was noise and movement everywhere. Now the soldiers seem to have folded themselves into the darkness like travellers inside a long woolen cocoon. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and glance at the nearest sleeping group. The overlapping fabrics rise and fall gently. Each breath, heat remains trapped beneath those layers. A small shared furnace created simply by human bodies resting close together. The stars above shine sharply in the winter sky, and frost begins forming along the edges of helmets and wagon rims. But beneath the blankets and cloaks, the soldiers continue sleeping, their warmth preserved through closeness, their comfort shared. And in the middle of this frozen medieval camp, companionship becomes another quiet defense against the cold. The camp has grown quieter than before. The last murmurs of conversation have faded into the dark, leaving behind the soft sounds of sleeping soldiers and the steady crackle of dying fires. You sit near the embers and watch as a thin ribbon of steam rises from a pot that still hangs above the coals. Food remains one of the most reliable forms of warmth in this frozen place. Not warmth for the hands or face like the fire provides, but warmth that spreads slowly from the inside outward. The kind that settles deep in the chest and stomach, allowing the body to resist the cold for hours. You lean closer to the pot and inhale the lingering scent of herbs and broth. Even though most of the stew has already been eaten, the smell still floats gently through the air. Barley, onion, perhaps a few pieces of salted pork. Nothing luxurious. Yet in winter even simple food becomes powerful. Medieval records describing army life often mention how soldiers relied heavily on warm, hearty meals during cold campaigns. Stews, broths, and porridge appeared frequently because they could be prepared in large pots shared easily among many men, and most importantly served hot. Hot food gives the body energy. Energy becomes heat. You watch as a soldier approaches the pot with a wooden bowl in hand. He tilts the pot slightly and pours out the last thin portion of broth. Steam curls upward as he lifts the bowl toward his mouth. He drinks slowly, almost ceremonially. The warmth spread through him with each swallow. A faint smile appears beneath his beard before he returns to his bedroll. Food may not stop the wind or the frost, but it gives the body the strength needed to endure them. The soldiers know this well. Earlier in the evenings, you saw them gather eagerly around the cooking fires as the stew finished boiling. Bowls were passed from hand to hand and men leaned close to the steam rising from their meals. Even the act of holding a hot bowl warms the fingers. You remember how one soldier held his bowl close to his face, letting the steam drift across his cheeks before taking a sip. A small luxury, but a meaningful one. A curious little observation appears in several medieval travel diaries. Some writers noted that soldiers and travellers often preferred soups and thick porridge during winter journeys because solid foods cooled quickly in cold air, while liquid meals retained heat longer and were easier to consume when hands were stiff with cold. So stews became the natural choice for cold weather. Large iron cauldrons made the process simple. A few ingredients could be added to boiling water and left to simmer for hours while soldiers attended to other tasks. Barley, oats, dried peas, onions, salted meat and herbs were all common ingredients. Nothing fancy. Just dependable fuel. Across the camp you notice a group of soldiers who appear to have saved a little of their stew for later. One man lifts a small clay cup and warms it over the embers before sipping carefully. The steam rises around his face as he drinks. You can almost feel the warmth spreading through his chest. Modern researchers studying medieval nutrition often point out that soldiers required enormous amounts of calories during winter campaigns. Marching long distances, carrying equipment and fighting battles in cold weather forced the body to burn energy quickly. Hot meals provided both warmth and the fuel needed to maintain body heat overnight. Without enough food, staying warm would become far more difficult. Your stomach feels warmer just thinking about it. The wind shifts again, sending a faint swirl of ash across the ground. The fire crackles softly as the remaining logs settle deeper into glowing coals. One soldier nearby pulls a small loaf of bread from his pouch. He tears off a piece and dips it into the last of his broth before eating slowly. Bread soaks up the warmth of the soup like a sponge. Another man near him holds his hands around a clay mug that still releases faint wisps of steam. Even after finishing the drink, he keeps the mug cupped between his palms. The heat lingers in the clay. That small warmth spreads into his fingers. You notice that no one wastes the heat of food or drink. Every sip, every bowl, every cup becomes another layer of defense against the cold night. From somewhere deeper in the camp comes the quiet clatter of another pot being lifted from a fire. Perhaps another group of soldiers is finishing their meal later than the rest. The scent of cooking drifts faintly across the field, a mixture of smoke and herbs. Comforting. Experts who study medieval camp life sometimes discuss how communal meals helped maintain morale during difficult campaigns. Eating together around the fire gave soldiers the chance to relax, briefly share conversation, and restore energy before the long hours of darkness. Food nourished more than the body. It steadied the mind. You glance around the camp again. Many of the soldiers are now asleep, their cloaks pulled tightly around them. The fires glow softly beside their bedrolls. Yet here and there, a few men still sit awake with bowls or mugs in their hands, savouring the last warmth of the evening meal. They drink slowly, stretching the comfort for as long as possible. You shift closer to the embers and feel their heat brush your face. The air above the fire shimmers gently as the last flames flicker. Even after the stew is gone, its warmth lingers inside the soldiers who drank it, a quiet fire within their bodies, helping them face the long frozen hours ahead. The embers beside you glow softly now, casting a dim red light across the frozen ground. Most of the camp has fallen into sleep, wrapped in cloaks and blankets, their breathing slow and steady. Yet not everyone is resting. A few soldiers remain awake beside the fires. Some stare into the coals quietly. Others pass small cups or leather flasks between them. The faint scent of fermented drink drifts through the air, mixing with smoke and wool. Ale, sometimes wine, occasionally something stronger. You watch as one soldier lifts a wooden cup toward the firelight before taking a slow drink. His shoulders relax slightly and he exhales with a quiet sigh. The warmth he feels is immediate, or at least it seems that way. Alcohol had long been a common part of daily life in medieval Europe. Many historical records show that soldiers often received ale or wine as part of their regular rations. These drinks were safer to consume than untreated water in many places, and they also provided a small amount of energy. During cold nights like this one, they served another purpose. They created the feeling of warmth. You notice how the soldiers react after drinking. Faces loosen, hands relax around the cups. The cold seems to fade for a moment, yet the warmth is somewhat deceptive. Medical historians studying old army diets often explain that alcohol produces a temporary sensation of heat by widening blood vessels near the skin. This causes the body to release heat outward more quickly, which makes a person feel warmer even though the body may actually be losing warmth faster. The soldiers around you do not know the science. They simply know that a drink makes the cold easier to tolerate for a while. One soldier pours a small measure of ale into another man's cup. They exchange a few quiet words before drinking together. Their breath rises into the cold air like pale smoke. The moment feels almost ceremonial. In many medieval armies, shared drinking helped strengthen bonds between soldiers. A simple cup passed between companions could create a sense of camaraderie during long campaigns far from home. The drink warms the throat. The companionship warms the spirit. You see one man hold his cup close to the fire for a moment before drinking. The liquid inside releases faint steam. Warm ale might not sound appealing to modern tastes, but on a night like this, it becomes surprisingly comforting. A small detail recorded in several medieval accounts suggests that soldiers sometimes added spices or herbs to their drinks during winter. Ingredients such as cloves, cinnamon, or honey might be stirred into wine or ale to create a mildly spiced beverage. These additions improved the flavour and gave the drink an even warmer sensation. Some travellers described the result as both warming and uplifting after a long cold march. Across the camp, a pair of soldiers share a small leather flask. One takes a quick sip before handing it back to the other. Their cloaks touch as they sit side by side near the dying fire. The glow from the embers lights their faces in faint red shadows. They speak quietly, though their words are too soft to hear. Laughter appears briefly, then fades again into the calm silence of the night. Modern historians studying medieval military life often discuss how alcohol served both practical and social roles in army camps. While excessive drinking could lead to trouble, small portions were commonly accepted and even encouraged during cold weather. A moderate drink could help soldiers relax enough to sleep. Sleep, after all, was another essential defense against the cold. Without rest, the body loses its ability to regulate temperature effectively. You watch as one of the men finishes his drink and places the empty cup beside him. He rubs his hands together briefly before pulling his cloak tightly around his shoulders. The warmth from the ale fades slowly, but the calm feeling remains. He lies back on his straw bedding and closes his eyes. The cold air still surrounds him, yet he appears more comfortable now. Not immune to the winter night, just a little less troubled by it. The fire beside you sinks further into glowing coals. Small sparks drift upward before disappearing into the dark sky. The soldiers who were drinking begin settling down as well. One wraps his cloak completely around his body like a cocoon. Another rests his head on a folded saddle blanket. Their cups remain beside the fire, empty now. You breathe slowly and watch the camp sink deeper into silence. A few guards still move along the outer edges, their boots crunching softly on frozen grass. Their cloaks flap gently in the breeze as they patrol between wagons and horses, but most of the camp sleeps. The faint scent of ale still lingers in the air. Not enough to warm the entire camp, but enough to bring a brief moment of comfort to the soldiers who shared it. You stretch your hands toward the coals one last time before pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The warmth from the drink may fade, but the quiet companionship around the fire leaves something behind. A small reminder that even on the coldest medieval nights, soldiers rarely face the darkness entirely alone. The embers beside you glow faintly now, giving off a steady warmth that barely pushes back the cold creeping across the ground. Most of the soldiers have wrapped themselves tightly in cloaks and blankets, their shapes forming quiet bundles scattered around the camp. The wind has grown softer, though the air still carries the sharp bite of winter. Your attention drifts downward toward your boots. Feet suffer first in the cold. Hands may warm again beside a fire, and cloaks protect the body, but the ground beneath a soldier never truly stops pulling heat away. The frozen earth seems determined to steal warmth from anything resting upon it. You shift slightly and feel the stiffness in your toes. Even through thick leather, the chill slowly finds its way in. Around you, several soldiers are tending carefully to their footwear before settling fully into sleep. One man sits beside the fire, removing his boots while holding them close to the embers. He turns them slowly so the warmth dries the leather without scorching it. Another soldier unwraps strips of cloth from around his feet and replaces them with fresh dry ones pulled from his pack. Foot wraps were common during the Middle Ages. Instead of modern socks, many soldiers used long strips of wool or linen cloth wrapped carefully around the feet before putting on boots. When wrapped properly, these cloth layers trapped warmth while also absorbing moisture from sweat. Sources from medieval military life frequently describe the importance of keeping feet dry and protected during long marches. Wet feet in winter could quickly lead to numbness, blistering, and even frost injury. The soldiers around you seem well aware of this. One man lifts his foot toward the firelight and gently massages his toes through the cloth wrap, encouraging blood to circulate again. Another taps his boots together before sliding them back on, satisfied that the leather has warmed enough. You notice how thick the boots themselves appear. The leather is sturdy, often reinforced with extra layers along the soles and toes. Some soldiers even stuff bits of straw or wool inside their boots to add insulation. It may not look elegant, but it works. A rather unusual trick mentioned in a few historical accounts describes soldiers placing small amounts of dry grass or straw between their foot wraps and boots during extremely cold weather. The extra layer trapped air and helped preserve warmth inside the footwear. It was a simple form of insulation using whatever materials were available nearby. You watch as one soldier near the fire pulls a handful of straw from a bedding bundle and tucks it carefully inside his boot before putting it on again. He presses his foot down firmly and nods with quiet approval. The adjustment likely makes an immediate difference. Across the camp, another man sits with his legs extended toward the embers. He lifts each boot in turn, checking the soles for moisture before placing them back on the ground. The routine feels methodical. Winter forces discipline into even the smallest tasks. Experts studying medieval military equipment often emphasize that boots were among the most valuable items a soldier owned. Good footwear allowed armies to march across rough terrain, survive cold conditions, and remain ready for battle. Without proper boots, a soldier might become unable to march at all, and in an army on campaign, falling behind could mean far more danger than the cold itself. You feel the ground beneath your own feet again and notice how quickly it draws warmth away. It becomes clear why soldiers keep their boots on even while sleeping. Removing them might seem comfortable for a moment, but the cold ground would soon reclaim that comfort. So many men sleep with their boots still laced, ready to stand quickly if needed. Researchers examining medieval armies still discuss how effectively soldiers were able to prevent frost-related injuries during winter campaigns. Some evidence suggests that experienced troops developed practical habits such as frequent foot checks, drying boots near fires, and replacing damp foot wraps whenever possible. These small actions could make a tremendous difference over the course of a long campaign. You glance around the camp and see several men performing similar routines. One soldier rubs his feet vigorously before pulling fresh cloth around them. Another rotates his boots near the embers for a final moment before settling down onto his bedding. The quiet care they give to their feet reveals how essential those small details are. Marching, fighting, standing, watch. All of it depends on the strength of those two small points of contact with the earth. The fire crackles softly again as a small log shifts into the glowing coals. A soldier nearby stretches his legs toward the warmth and wiggles his toes inside his boots. You can almost imagine the relief spreading through them. A few moments later, he pulls his cloak down over his legs, sealing the warmth around his lower body. Slowly, one by one, the remaining soldiers settle into sleep. Their boots rest close to the fire, their feet wrapped carefully in the cloth and leather, protected as well as the medieval world allowed. You lean back slightly and listen to the quiet rhythm of the camp. Horses breathe softly in the distance. The wind whispers across the field. Embers glow like tiny stars scattered across the ground. And beneath heavy boots and careful layers of cloth, the soldiers' feet remain warm enough to carry them into another frozen morning. The fire beside you has grown quiet again, its orange glow now more ember than flame. The soldiers around the camp sleep beneath cloaks and blankets, their shapes barely moving, except for the slow rhythm of breathing. A faint layer of frost has begun forming along the edges of saddles and wagon wheels. The ground itself feels colder than before. You shift your position slightly and immediately notice the difference. Even through thick boots and clothing, the frozen earth presses upward with stubborn determination. The cold seems to travel through the soil, through the straw beneath you, through every layer, until it finally reaches the body. This is why the soldiers cared so much about what they sleep on, not just what they sleep under. You glance across the camp and see bundles of pale straw spread across the ground like small golden islands in the dim firelight. Nearly every sleeping soldier rests on some kind of bedding made from straw or dry grass. It may look humble, but it serves an important purpose. Historical records describing medieval travel and military life often note that straw bedding was one of the most common ways to insulate the body from cold ground. Even a few inches of dry plant material could reduce the amount of heat lost into the soil during the night. Air trapped between the straw stems created a barrier between the sleeper and the frozen earth. In other words, the straw worked like a natural mattress. You reach down and touch the bedding beneath your cloak. The stems feel dry and slightly rough, but they compress gently under your weight. When arranged properly, the straw forms a surprisingly comfortable layer. Comfort matters more than one might expect. A soldier who sleeps well can march farther, think more clearly, and endure hardship more easily the next day. Across the fire, one man wakes briefly and shifts his position. His straw bedding rustles softly as he pulls more of it beneath his shoulders before settling again into sleep. The sound is faint but comforting. Straw whispers rather than creaks. You notice that some soldiers have gathered large bundles while others use smaller piles. The size of the bedding often depends on what materials were available nearby. If the army camped near farmland, straw could be plentiful. If they camped on open ground or rocky hills, soldiers might rely on grass leaves or whatever dry plants they could gather before nightfall. One interesting custom mentioned in a few travel accounts describes soldiers shaking out fresh straw each evening to remove moisture or frost that had formed during the previous night. Dry bunting was essential. Damp straw could quickly drain warmth instead of preserving it. You watch as a soldier near the edge of the camp performs exactly that routine. He lifts a bundle of straw and shakes it briskly before spreading it again on the ground. Small bits scatter across the frost like pale confetti. Satisfied, he lies down and pulls his cloak over his shoulders. The straw beneath him creates a soft mound that lifts his body slightly above the frozen soil. Another soldier nearby uses a slightly different arrangement. Instead of spreading the straw flat, he piles it thicker beneath his hips and shoulders while leaving the middle slightly hollow. The shape resembles a shallow nest. This allows the body to sink gently into the bedding while keeping the most sensitive areas insulated. It's a small but clever adjustment. Researchers studying medieval encampments sometimes explore how soldiers improvise bedding during long campaigns. Archaeological findings from old campsites occasionally reveal traces of plant material layers beneath where tents once stood, suggesting that soldiers consistently sought ways to separate themselves from cold ground. The idea appears across many cultures and regions. Wherever people slept outdoors in winter, insulating the ground became a priority. You notice that some soldiers combined straw with other materials. A saddle blanket may lie beneath the straw, or a cloak may cover it from above. Each layer adds another barrier between the body and the earth. Layering does not only apply to clothing, it applies to bedding as well. The wind drifts lightly through the camp, again stirring the edges of loose straw bundles. A few strands lift into the air before settling again across the ground. The camp remains quiet. Only the occasional shift of a sleeping soldier disturbs the stillness. One man near the fire rolls onto his side, compressing the straw beneath his shoulder. The bedding reshapes itself around him, holding warmth in place. You realize how important that simple plant material has become. Without it, the cold ground would steal warmth relentlessly. With it, the soldiers gain at least a small measure of protection. The embers glow softly as you settle deeper into your own bedding. The straw beneath your cloak feels surprisingly warm now, holding the heat that your body has slowly gathered. The frozen earth still waits beneath it, but the straw keeps that cold at a distance. Above you, the stars shimmer quietly in the winter sky. Around you, medieval soldiers sleep upon their simple beds of straw, and that humble layer of dried grass quietly helps them survive another long freezing night. The camp sleeps quietly now. Most fires have faded into low-glowing beds of embers, and the soldiers wrapped in cloaks lie still across the frozen ground. Above them, the night sky stretches wide and clear, filled with cold, bright stars that seem sharper in winter air. You breathe slowly and notice how still everything feels. But if you look carefully beyond the sleeping camp, you begin to see something interesting along the edges of the field. Small ridges of snow, low walls of packed white that curve around certain sections of the camp. They are not natural drifts left by the wind. The soldiers built them. During winter campaigns, armies often use the landscape itself as protection against cold winds. Snow, earth, and even piles of brush could be shaped into barriers that slowed the movement of freezing air across a campsite. The idea is simple. Stop the wind and the night becomes easier to endure. A number of surviving military descriptions from the Middle Ages note that soldiers frequently used whatever materials were nearby to create makeshift windbreaks. In winter conditions, this sometimes meant piling snow into low walls around tents or sleeping areas. You rise slightly and walk toward one of these small ridges near the outer edge of the camp. The snow has been packed firmly by boots and gloved hands until it forms a sturdy barrier almost as high as your knees. Behind it, several soldiers lie sleeping beneath their cloaks. The difference is noticeable immediately. The wind that brushes your face weakens as soon as you step behind the wall. Even a short barrier can break the strength of a moving breeze. The soldiers resting there clearly understand this advantage. Their bedding lies tucked close against the inner side of the snow ridge, forming a protected hollow where the air remains calmer. You crouch beside the wall and touch its surface. The packed snow feels solid and cold, but it also holds its shape remarkably well. Once compressed snow becomes surprisingly strong. Across the camp, you notice other forms of wind protection as well. Some soldiers have stacked saddles and supply bags into small walls. Others sleep behind wagons positioned carefully to block the direction of the wind. Every object becomes part of it. A curious little note appears in some travel accounts from Northern Europe describing how soldiers stationed in colder regions occasionally shaped snow into shallow sleeping trenches. These trenches created a pocket below ground level where the wind could not reach as easily. The idea may sound uncomfortable, but it often made the difference between shivering all night and sleeping with relative warmth. Cold air tends to move across open surfaces. Lower spaces sometimes remain calmer. You see something similar near one of the larger tents, where a shallow depression has been cleared in the snow. A few soldiers lie within that small hollow, their cloaks pulled high while the edges of the trench shield them from the breeze. They appear surprisingly peaceful. You step back toward the fire circle, again watching the quiet shapes of men sleeping inside their improvised shelters. The entire camp now resembles a patchwork of small protected spaces. Snow ridges here, wagon walls there, clusters of cloaked figures tucked behind equipment or low terrain. Nothing grand or permanent, just clever adjustments made with whatever materials the winter landscape provides. Modern historians who study medieval campaigns sometimes examine how armies adapted to harsh environments using simple engineering like this. Rather than constructing elaborate structures, soldiers often relied on quick solutions that could be built in minutes using snow earth, wood, or gear already present in camp. Speed mattered. Armies moved often and any shelter needed to be temporary. The snow walls around you may only last a single night before being trampled or melted, but for these few hours they perform an important task. They break the wind. You return to your place beside the fire and settle down again, pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The embers glow faintly, reflecting in the polished edges of nearby helmets. Beyond the firelight, the snow walls curve gently around sleeping groups of soldiers. They look almost like quiet white guardians standing watch through the night. The wind drifts across the field again, brushing lightly against the outer edges of the camp. When it reaches the snow barriers, its strength fades. Inside the protected spaces, the air remains calmer. The soldiers sleep. You listen to the quiet rhythm of the camp once more. Horses breathing softly, straw rustling as someone shifts in sleep, the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the trees. And around the camp, small ridges of snow continue their silent work, holding back the winter wind, giving medieval soldiers a little more warmth as the long night slowly passes. The camp rests in a deep quiet now, the kind of silence that settles only after many people have finally drifted into sleep. The embers beside you glow with a faint red light, and above them, thin streams of smoke curl upward into the cold night air. The wind has almost disappeared, leaving the entire field wrapped in stillness. But somewhere out there in the darkness, someone is awake. You hear it before you see it. The soft crunch of boots moving slowly across frost-covered ground. A guard! Even while the camp sleeps, watch must be kept. Armies in the medieval world could never fully relax, especially during campaigns far from friendly territory. Enemies might strike in the night, thieves might slip toward the supply wagons, or wandering animals could startle the horses. So the watch continues. You glance toward the edge of the camp and see a cloaked figure moving carefully between wagons and sleeping soldiers. A spear rests in his hand, and a thick hood covers most of his head. His breath rises in pale clouds each time he exhales. Standing guard in winter is one of the hardest tasks in camp. When a soldier sleeps, blankets and cloaks trap warmth around the body. When a soldier walks slowly through the night, that warmth escapes more easily. Stillness becomes dangerous. Accounts written by medieval chroniclers often describe guards stamping their feet or shifting their weight repeatedly during cold nights. The simple act of movement helped keep blood circulating through their legs and feet. You see that habit clearly now. The guard pauses beside a wagon and taps one boot against the frozen ground several times. Then he switches to the other foot. A quiet rhythm. Stamp. Pause. Stamp. It may look like impatience, but it serves a very practical purpose. Blood must keep moving. Without motion, the cold quickly creeps into muscles and joints. Hands stiffen, toes numb, and reaction time slows. The guard lifts his hands briefly and blows warm breath across his fingers before gripping his spear again. Across the camp, another watchman appears, walking slowly along the opposite side of the sleeping area. The two exchange a quiet greeting as they pass one another. Their voices are low, almost whispers. Sound carries easily across frozen ground. Several historical descriptions of army life mention that night guards often worked in short shifts during winter campaigns. Rather than leaving one soldier exposed to the cold for many hours, commanders frequently rotated watch duty to prevent exhaustion and frost-related injuries. A tired guard becomes an ineffective guard. You watch the man near you walk toward one of the small fires that still burns faintly beside a wagon. He crouches briefly, stretching his hands toward the warmth. Only a moment, long enough to warm his fingers before continuing his patrol. A rather curious habit recorded in a few military writings describes how some guards carried small heated stones wrapped in cloth during winter watches. These stones were warmed near the fire before the guard shift began and placed inside pockets or gloves to provide temporary warmth. The heat would fade eventually, but it offered comfort during the first hour of the watch. Looking at the soldiers moving through the camp tonight, you can easily imagine how valuable that small trick might be. The guard straightens it again and resumes walking. His boots leave faint prints across the frost as he moves between the rows of sleeping soldiers. You notice that he occasionally stops to listen. The night holds many quiet sounds. The breathing of horses, the rustle of straw, the distant hoot of an owl somewhere beyond the trees. But the guard listens for something else. Anything unusual. Anything that does not belong. Researchers who study medieval warfare often explore how armies organized night watches and temporary camps. While the exact systems varied from place to place, most forces relied on rotating patrols that circled the camp repeatedly until dawn. Simple methods, but effective enough when soldiers remained alert. You follow the guard with your eyes as he continues his slow circuit. His cloak moves gently with each step, and the spear in his hand glints faintly in the firelight. He pauses again near a group of sleeping soldiers and gently nudges a log back into the embers with the end of his spear. The fire flares briefly. A small kindness, keeping the warmth alive for those who sleep. The guard remains there for a moment longer, warming his hands again before moving on. You imagine how long the night must feel to someone walking in circles through the cold while everyone else rests. The stars remain bright overhead. The frost grows thicker along the edges of cloaks and saddles. Yet the guards continue their quiet work. One man disappears into the darkness beyond the wagons, while another approaches from the far side of camp. Their patrol paths cross like slow-moving shadows. Each step keeps the camp safe. Each step keeps the cold from claiming their strength. You settle deeper into your cloak and listen to the steady rhythm of boots passing occasionally through the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, another guard stamps his feet against the frozen ground. The sound echoes softly across the sleeping camp, proof that someone remains awake, watching, waiting, keeping the long winter night under careful guard. The guards continue their slow patrol through the silent camp, but for most of the soldiers the night has deepened into sleep. You sit close to the faint glow of the fire and look across the field of tents rising in soft shapes beneath the starlight. Their canvas walls move gently whenever a small breeze passes through. Tents offer another layer of protection against the winter cold. Not perfect protection, but enough to matter. You stand and walk slowly toward one of the larger tents positioned near the center of the camp. The canvas covering stretches across a simple wooden frame, its edges pinned tightly to the ground. Frost clings to the outer surface like a thin dusting of white powder. You lift the entrance flap carefully and step inside. The difference in temperature is subtle but unnoticeable. The tent does not feel warm exactly yet. The air inside lacks the sharp bite that fills the open field. The cloth walls block the wind, allowing the warmth from sleeping bodies to remain trapped within the small space. Several soldiers lie side by side on straw bedding, their cloaks pulled high around their shoulders. Their breaths rise and fall steadily in the dim interior. The canvas roof arches above them like a pale ceiling. Records from medieval military campaigns frequently describe tents as essential equipment for officers and knights, though ordinary soldiers sometimes shared them as well depending on supplies and rank. These tents varied widely in size, but even the simplest design could shield occupants from wind and drifting snow. Wind protection made a tremendous difference during winter nights. Without the constant movement of air pulling heat away from the body, cloaks and blankets worked far more effectively. You notice that the interior space feels almost calm compared with the open camp outside. The canvas walls soften the sounds of the night. The wind becomes a distant whisper instead of a sharp gust. Even the glow from the nearby fire filters through the cloth in a gentle orange haze. One soldier shifts in his sleep, rustling the straw beneath him before settling again. Another pulls his cloak slightly tighter around his neck. The air inside the tent holds a faint scent of wool leather and smoke. Not unpleasant, just the natural smell of men and equipment sharing a small shelter during winter. A curious little observation preserved in a few medieval travel descriptions suggests that some soldiers lined the lower edges of their tents with extra cloaks, straw bundles, or even saddle blankets to seal small gaps where wind might enter. The effort may seem minor, but even narrow openings could allow cold air to sweep through the tent during the night. Sealing those gaps helped maintain a calmer interior environment. You glance toward the entrance flap again and notice that a saddle blanket has indeed been folded along the bottom edge, pressing the canvas against the ground. The soldiers inside clearly understand the importance of blocking drafts. Outside the tent, the wind may shift and swirl freely. Inside, the air remains almost still. Researchers studying medieval encampments often point out that tents functioned less as heaters and more as windbreaks. Unlike modern insulated shelters, most medieval tents were made from relatively simple cloth. They could not generate warmth on their own, but they helped preserve the warmth produced by human bodies inside. In a crowded tent, that warmth could accumulate surprisingly well. You sit quietly for a moment and listen to the steady breathing of the sleeping soldiers. The combined body heat of several men has already changed the feel of the space. Not hot, but comfortable enough to rest. The canvas walls sway slightly as the breeze touches them from outside. The movement is slow and gentle, almost like the quiet breathing of the tent itself. Beyond the fabric, you hear faint sounds from the camp. A horse shifting its weight, a guard walking past with measured steps, the distant crackle of a fire being stirred back to life. Inside the tent, however, those sounds feel softened and distant. Another soldier rolls onto his side, pressing his shoulder against a companion beside him. Their cloaks overlap slightly, trapping warmth between them. The tent roof holds that warmth overhead, preventing it from escaping too quickly into the open ski. You realize how many small layers of protection surround these soldiers' naui. Cloaks, straw bedding, shared body heat, canvas walls. Each one contributes something small. Together they form a fragile but effective shield against the winter cold. You step back towards the entrance and lift the flap again. The cold air from outside brushes against your face immediately. The difference reminds you just how valuable even a thin barrier of cloth can be. You close the flap carefully behind you and return to the fire. Across the camp, dozens of similar tents stand quietly beneath the stars. Their shapes rise like pale hills scattered across the dark field. Inside them, medieval soldiers sleep while the winter night continues around them. The wind drifts gently past the canvas walls. But inside those simple shelters, the cold loses some of its power, and that small advantage is now enough to help another group of weary soldiers rest until morning. You return to the fading warmth of the fire, settling again among the quiet shapes of sleeping soldiers. The embers glow low, barely lighting the camp now, and the sky above remains sharp with winter stars. Most of the men around you sleep in the open field or beneath tents, but not every soldier in the medieval world spent cold nights like this. Some had stone walls around them. You imagine stepping away from the temporary camp and into the courtyard of medieval castle during winter. The wind still sweeps across the stone towers and frost still gathers along the parapets. Yet inside the thick walls of the fortress, soldiers sleep in barracks instead of open fields. At first thought, that sounds much warmer. Stone walls seem strong and protective, but as you picture the interior more clearly, you realize something important. Stone holds cold very well. Accounts preserved from castle life during the Middle Ages often mention how barracks inside fortresses could feel bitterly cold during winter months. Thick walls protected soldiers from wind and snow, yet those same walls absorbed the chill of the season and released it slowly into the rooms. A stone chamber could remain cold long after the sun had risen outside. You imagine walking into one of those barracks rooms now. The ceiling beams stretch overhead, darkened by years of smoke from small hearth fires. Rows of wooden sleeping platforms line the walls covered with straw bedding and wool blankets. Several soldiers lie beneath cloaks much like the ones you saw in the camp. Even indoors, the same methods of staying warm remain necessary. Straw bedding still lifts the body from cold surfaces. Wool cloaks still trap warmth around the shoulders. Shared sleeping spaces still allow soldiers to preserve body heat through the long night. You picture one soldier sitting beside a small hearth built against the stone wall. The fire burns modestly, its warmth spreading only a short distance across the room. Firewood inside castles was valuable and carefully rationed. Large roaring fires were rare in ordinary barracks. Instead, small hearths or braziers provided limited warmth for groups of soldiers gathered nearby. The rest relied on clothing and bedding, much like those in the open camp. One curious detail appears in several descriptions of castle life. Some barracks rooms contained raised wooden sleeping platforms rather than individual beds. These platforms allowed several soldiers to sleep side by side above the cold floor. The design reduced heat loss while also saving space. A raised platform prevented the body from touching stone directly, which made a noticeable difference in winter conditions. You imagine the soldiers climbing onto those wooden frames before wrapping themselves in cloaks and blankets. The wood beneath them would feel far less hostile than the frozen stone floor, yet the room itself would still remain chilly. Researchers who study medieval castles sometimes discuss the challenge of heating such massive stone structures. Fireplaces warmed small areas effectively, but heat rarely spread far beyond the immediate space around the hearth. High ceilings and thick walls allowed warmth to drift upward or vanish into the stone. For the soldiers sleeping along the walls, the temperature might remain only slightly warmer than outside. Still, the fortress offered advantages the open camp could not. The wind stayed outside. Snow could not drift across the sleeping men, and the sense of security behind heavy gates allowed deeper rest. You imagine a group of soldiers gathered near the barracks hearth, warming their hands before lying down for the night. Their armour hangs from wooden pegs along the wall, while their boots rest near the fire to dry. A faint smell of smoke fills the room. The air feels dry compared with the damp chill outside. One soldier adjusts the straw mattress beneath him while another folds his cloak beneath his head as a pillow. Even within the stone fortress, small comforts matter. You return your attention to the camp around you. The open field may lack walls and roofs, yet the soldiers sleeping here use many of the same techniques. Straw beneath them, wool around them, companions close beside them. Whether inside a castle or beneath the stars, winter demands similar solutions. Across the camp, one soldier rolls slightly in his sleep and pulls his cloak tighter across his chest. The frost along the edges of nearby wagons glitters faintly in the starlight. The fire beside you releases a final quiet crack as one of the embers collapses inward. You glance once more toward the rows of tents and sleeping figures. Somewhere far away inside a stone fortress, soldiers might be lying on wooden platforms beside a small hearth. Here in the open camp, others sleep beneath cloaks and stars. Different shelters, same winter night. And in both places, medieval soldiers rely on simple layers of warmth to endure the cold until morning. The embers beside you glow faintly in the darkness, their warmth gentle but steady. Most of the camp now sleeps deeply wrapped in layers of wool and straw. The wind has quieted again, leaving the night still enough that you can hear the slow breathing of horses and the occasional rustle of a cloak shifting against dry grass. You stretch your hands towards the last warmth of the fire and notice something interesting near the edge of the coals. Several smooth stones sit among the embers. At first, they look like ordinary rocks pulled from the ground earlier in the evening. But as you watch more closely, you realize they were placed there deliberately. Their surfaces glow slightly in the dim firelight, absorbing the heat of the flames. They are being warmed. One of the soldiers who had been sleeping nearby stirs and sits up slowly. He reaches toward the fire with a small piece of cloth wrapped around his hand and carefully lifts one of the stones. Even through the cloth, the heat must be strong. He carries the stone back to his bedding and slides it near his feet beneath the cloak. Then he lies down again. The small pocket of warmth created by that stone will last for quite some time. Written descriptions of winter travel from the medieval period often mention this simple method of carrying heat into bed. Stones or bricks were warmed beside a fire and then wrapped in cloth before being placed beneath blankets or near the feet. The warmth slowly spread through the bedding long after the fire itself had faded. You watch another soldier repeat the same routine. He crouches beside the embers, selects a stone with the end of a stick and rolls it gently toward the edge of the fire where it can cool slightly. Once it becomes safe to handle, he wraps it in a scrap of cloth and carries it to his sleeping place. The process is quiet and careful. No one wants to burn their bedding or skin. But the reward is worth the caution. A warm stone inside a cold bed can feel like a small miracle on a winter night. Some observers writing about medieval daily life recorded how this practice was not limited to soldiers. Travellers, farmers, and even monks sometimes used heated stones or ceramic warming bottles during cold seasons. The idea appears again and again wherever winters grow harsh. Simple objects storing heat, releasing it slowly through the night. Across the camp you see several small lumps beneath blankets that likely hide similar stones. The shapes sit near the feet or between folded cloaks where warmth will spread most effectively. The soldiers clearly understand how to place them. Heat rises, so starting near the feet allows warmth to travel upward through the bedding. You lean slightly closer to the embers and feel the faint warmth still radiating from the stones resting among them. Their surfaces glow dimly, almost like small captured suns hidden in the ashes. Researchers who examine historical household practices often discuss how people long ago relied on objects that could store heat. In homes, these might include ceramic bed warmers or heated metal pans placed beneath blankets. In army camps, however, simple stones served the same purpose with far less equipment. Nature provided the materials. All that was required was a fire and a little patience. One curious little habit occasionally mentioned in travel accounts describes soldiers testing the temperature of heated stones by briefly touching them against the inside of their wrist before wrapping them in cloth. The skin there was sensitive enough to detect excessive heat quickly. If the stone felt too hot, it was left to cool for a few moments longer. Practical knowledge passed quietly between generations. You notice one soldier doing exactly that now. He lifts a stone from the edge of the fire and touches it lightly against his wrist before nodding with approval. Moments later, it disappears down beneath his cloak. The warmth will remain there long after the fire fades completely. You sit back and watch the camp once more. Fires shrink into glowing circles. Cloaked figures lie motionless beneath the stars. Occasionally a guard walks slowly past, his footsteps soft against the frost. But beneath many blankets, small stones now radiate gentle warmth. Tiny hidden heaters scattered across the camp. Historians who study winter survival techniques often note how these modest solutions reveal the creativity of medieval soldiers. Without modern equipment, they relied on observation and experience to solve everyday problems. How do you carry heat away from a dying fire? You store it inside something solid. How do you keep warm through a freezing night? You place that warmth where the body needs it most. The solutions may be simple, but it works. Oh, it works. You pull your own cloak tighter around your shoulders and imagine the quiet comfort of a warm stone near your feet. Outside, the frost continues to gather along the ground, but inside the bedding of many sleeping soldiers, warmth lingers softly, and for a few precious hours, those small stones help turn a freezing night into something almost comfortable. The embers beside you have grown dimmer still, their glow now a deep red beneath a thin layer of ash. The night feels colder than before, the kind of cold that settles quietly and then refuses to leave. Around you the camp lies mostly silent, with soldiers wrapped tightly in cloaks and blankets, their shapes barely visible in the starlight. Yet here and there a few fires still burn. Not large flames, but steady little circles of heat that refuse to die completely. They are tended carefully by the soldiers who understand how important those small fires are. Fire brings warmth, but fire also brings risk. You watch a soldier kneeling beside one of the last active fires near the supply wagons. He adds a small stick to the coals rather than a large log. The flames rise gently for a moment before settling again. The goal is not brightness. The goal is control. Descriptions of medieval encampments written by chroniclers and travellers often mention that fires had to be managed with caution. A careless blaze could spread quickly through straw bedding, cloth tents, or piles of wooden equipment. In a crowded camp, a single spark could cause serious trouble. So soldiers learned to keep fires small and contained. You notice the ring of stone surrounding the fire before you. Those stones serve more than decoration. They create a barrier that prevents burning wood from rolling outward into nearby bedding or cloth. Even the shape of the fire pit matters. Shallow pits dug into the earth help shield flames from the wind while also reducing the chance that sparks drift across the camp. You lean forward slightly and watch a spark rise from the coals. It floats upward briefly before fading into darkness. A harmless moment, but too many sparks could become dangerous. A curious little detail appears in several medieval camp descriptions where soldiers are warned not to sleep too close to open flames. Some accounts even describe instances where cloaks or straw bedding caught fire during the night when someone shifted too near the embers. Fire warmed the camp, but it demanded respect. Across the field you see another small group of soldiers tending a fire beside a wagon. One man sits with a bucket of water nearby just in case the flames grow larger than intended. The precaution may seem excessive, yet it reveals how carefully experienced soldiers treated their fires. Researchers studying medieval campfires have often discussed the balance armies had to maintain between warmth and safety. Fires were essential for cooking and comfort, but they also introduced risks that commanders could not ignore. This balance required constant attention. You hear the quiet scrape of a stick against coals as the soldier near you rearranges the burning wood again. He spreads the embers slightly, reducing the height of the flame while allowing the heat to continue radiating outward. The fire now glows more than it burns, perfect for warmth, less likely to send sparks flying. Nearby, a sleeping soldier shifts under his cloak, momentarily lifting the fabric before settling again. The edge of his bedding lies only a few feet from the fire, close enough to feel its heat, far enough to remain safe. The arrangement appears deliberate. You glance toward the tents again and notice that most fires sit just outside their entrances, rather than directly inside. The warmth drifts inward through the open flap while the flames remain outside where smoke can escape. Smoke itself presents another challenge. In enclosed spaces, too much smoke can become dangerous. Some medieval accounts mention soldiers suffering headaches or dizziness after sleeping in poorly ventilated tents where fires burned too strongly. So fires were often placed where smoke could rise freely into the night sky. The cold air above carried it away. You watch the faint stream of smoke rising from the embers now. It curls upward slowly before dissolving into the dark sky. Another soldier approaches quietly and crouches beside the fire. He extends his hands toward the warmth for a moment before nudging a glowing coal closer to the center. His movements are careful and practiced. He knows exactly how far the flame should spread. A moment later he stands again and walks away, satisfied that the fire will continue burning safely. The camp feels almost like a living organism, each fire a small beating heart, each soldier responsible for keeping those hearts steady without letting them grow too wild. The wind drifts lightly through the camp, again brushing the edges of cloaks and tents. The fire responds with a soft flicker, but remains contained within its stone circle. You feel its warmth against your face and hands, a gentle comfort, yet you also feel the awareness that too much fire could quickly change this peaceful night into chaos. That awareness lives quietly in the habits of the soldiers around you. Logs placed carefully, stones arranged with intention, buckets kept nearby. You settle deeper into your cloak and watch the coals glow steadily. In this winter, campfire remains both friend and danger, a source of life that must always be watched. And through the long, frozen night, the soldiers guard their fires almost as carefully as they guard the camp itself. The night continues its slow passage across the frozen camp. The last lively conversations have faded completely now, leaving only the gentle sounds of breathing, crackling embers and the occasional movement of a horse shifting its weight. You sit quietly near the dim glow of the fire and notice how the air itself seems to carry a particular scent. It is not unpleasant, but it is unmistakable. The smell of wet wool. Many cloaks around you have absorbed traces of snow frost and sweat from the long day of marching. When wool becomes damp and then warms slightly near the fire, it releases a heavy earthy scent that drifts slowly through the air. It mixes with sour smoke, with leather, with the faint lingering aroma of stew cooked earlier in the evening. Together they create the distinct smell of a medieval winter camp. Descriptions written by travellers and soldiers from the Middle Ages sometimes mention how wool clothing carried strong scents after long use, especially during cold weather, when garments were worn constantly and rarely washed. In winter campaigns, soldiers often kept the same clothing on for many days or even weeks. Removing layers meant exposing the body to freezing temperatures, so cloaks and padded garments stayed wrapped around the body both day and night. You pull the edge of your cloak slightly closer and notice the same faint smell rising from the fabric. It reminds you that warmth often comes with certain trade-offs. The wool may smell a little heavy, but it keeps the cold away. Across the fire, a soldier shifts in his sleep, pressing his shoulder deeper into the folds of his cloak. When he moves, a puff of that familiar scent rises briefly into the air before fading again. The smell tells a quiet story. Snow that melted on shoulders earlier in the day, sweat from marching beneath armor, smoke drifting through the campfires, all of it absorbed by thick wool fibres. One curious observation preserved in a few travel diaries suggests that people during the medieval period were often far more accustomed to the natural scents of wool and leather than modern readers might expect. To them, these smells simply meant clothing doing its job. Warmth mattered more than freshness. You notice another soldier hanging his cloak near the edge of a small fire. He has stretched the fabric across a low branch so the heat can dry the damp areas along the hem. Slowly the moisture disappears. The wool stiffens slightly as it dries. Moments later he pulls the cloak back around his shoulders and settles into his bedding again. The scent lingers in the air like a reminder of the day's journey. Modern historians studying medieval textiles often discuss how wool was uniquely suited for harsh environments. Unlike many fabrics, wool continues to provide insulation even when damp. The fibres trap air in tiny pockets that preserve warmth despite moisture. This property made wool invaluable for soldiers and travellers alike. Without it, winter survival would have been far more difficult. You glance across the camp and see cloaks draped over saddles, wagon rails and tent poles. Many of them hang briefly near small fires where soldiers hope to dry the fabric before morning. The camp almost resembles a quiet forest of wool, dark shapes hanging in the firelight, each one holding the scent of those smoke and travel. A soldier nearby lifts the collar of his cloak and presses it briefly to his face. Perhaps he is simply blocking the wind, or perhaps he is enjoying the warmth trapped inside the folds of fabric. Either way, the cloak serves its purpose well. You listen to the quiet sounds of the night again. Horses breathe softly beyond the wagons. Straw rustles as someone turns over in sleep. Somewhere a guard coughs quietly before continuing his patrol. And through it all, the scent of wool and smoke lingers gently in the cold air. Experts who study medieval daily life often point out that smells played a much larger role in historical environments than modern people realise. Camps, towns and castles all carried distinct scents shaped by animals, fires, clothing and cooking. A winter army camp had its own particular mixture: smoke, leather, metal, and the warm, heavy scent of wool cloaks worn by hundreds of soldiers. You breathe slowly and feel that scent surrounding you now. It may not be the fragrance of a modern home, but here in the frozen darkness it signals something comforting. Warm clothing, dry fabric, protection against the night. You settle deeper into your cloak as the embers glow softly beside you. The smell of wool fades slightly as the fire burns lower. Around the camp, the soldiers sleep peacefully, their cloaks wrapped tightly against the cold, and in the quiet air above them the scent of smoke and wool drifts gently through the winter night. The cold air above the camp carries the faint smell of smoke and wool as the night deepens further. Most of the soldiers remain wrapped in sleep, their cloaks rising and falling slowly with each breath. The fires now glow faintly and the stars appear brighter than before, as though the sky itself has sharpened in the winter chill. You sit quietly beside the fading embers and notice something beyond the immediate circle of soldiers and tents. Movement near the far edge of the camp. Not guards this time. A small group of figures moving slowly between wagons and supply bundles. Their steps are careful but familiar, as if they belong here just as much as the soldiers. These are the camp followers. In medieval armies, soldiers rarely travelled alone. Campaigns often included a number of civilians who accompanied the troops. Some were family members, some were merchants or cooks, and others worked as labourers, laundresses or animal handlers. The camp at night might appear quiet, but these people still worked long after many soldiers had gone to sleep. One of the figures approaches a small fire and begins stirring the embers with a stick. Another adjusts a pot hanging from a low iron hook, checking whether the remaining broth inside is frozen. Their work never truly ends. Records written during various medieval campaigns reveal that camp followers played a significant role in the daily functioning of armies. They helped prepare meals, repair clothing, tend animals, and carry supplies that soldiers relied upon. Without them, many armies would have struggled to operate efficiently. You watch as one woman kneels beside a pile of cloaks and begins brushing frost from the fabric with quick, steady movements. The frost falls away in tiny, sparkling crystals. Moments later, she folds the cloak neatly and sets it beside a sleeping soldier. Perhaps it belongs to him. Perhaps she simply noticed it lying in the snow. Either way, the gesture ensures that the garment remains dry and ready for morning. A small but thoughtful. Yes. Nearby, another camp follower checks the harness of a horse tied beside a wagon. The animal shifts its weight and exhales a slow cloud of brawl as he sucks a breath into the cold air. The man rubs the horse's neck briefly, both to calm the animal and to keep frost from forming along the leather straps. Such quiet tasks help the camp remain functional through the night. An intriguing detail occasionally mentioned in travel accounts from the Middle Ages is that some camp followers developed reputations as skilled cooks who could prepare warming broths even with very limited ingredients. These simple meals, served late at night or early in the morning, helped soldiers regain strength after long marches or battles. A pot of hot soup could restore warmth faster than almost anything else. Across the camp, you see a small fire being coaxed back to life by one of the followers. The man adds a few dry twigs and blows gently until the embers glow brighter. Soon a thin flame appears, not large enough to wake the sleeping soldiers, just enough to warm a small pot of liquid. You notice how carefully the flame is kept low and controlled. Even civilians living among the army understand the importance of maintaining safe fires during winter nights. Too large a blaze could cause chaos. Too little heat might allow water to freeze. The balance must be maintained. Scholars who study medieval military logistics often emphasize that the presence of camp followers varied widely depending on the region and the type of army involved. Some forces travelled with large numbers of civilians, while others limited the practice more strictly. Even so, many campaigns depended heavily on these helpers. Armies needed cooks. They needed people to care for animals. They needed hands to mend clothing and prepare supplies. You watch the small group continue their quiet tasks. One person checks a bundle of firewood stacked beneath a wagon. Another pours a little warm broth into a clay cup and drinks it slowly beside the fire. Their work seems calm and almost routine. The soldiers sleep, but the camp itself never truly stops moving. The wind brushes lightly across the field again, carrying a few sparks upward from the revived fire. The followers quickly adjust the wood to keep the flames contained. Everything here revolves around balance, warmth without danger, activity without noise, care without disturbance. You settle deeper into your cloak and observe the quiet scene. The civilians move like gentle shadows through the camp, making small adjustments that help everyone endure the cold night. A cloak shaken free of frost, a fire revived, a horse checked for ice along its harness. None of these tasks appear dramatic, yet each one contributes to the survival of the entire camp. In the morning, when soldiers rise and prepare for another day of marching, many of them will find their cloaks dry, their food prepared, and their horses ready. They may not even notice the quiet work that made those things possible, but you see it now. In the stillness of the winter night while most of the army sleeps, the small fire that the camp followers revived continues to burn quietly, its glow faint but steady against the dark field. Around it, the last movements of the night gradually slow as even the helpers finish their tasks and withdraw into blankets and cloaks. The camp settles once again into that deep silence that belongs only to winter nights. You sit quietly and let your gaze travel outward beyond the sleeping wagons and tents. In the distance, the outline of a stone fortress rises against the sky. Tonight, the army waits here because of that fortress. A siege. During medieval warfare, winter did not always stop armies from surrounding enemy strongholds. In many cases, the cold months simply transformed the struggle into something slower and quieter. Instead of battles and charges, there was waiting in the snow, waiting through long nights much like this one. Written accounts from medieval campaigns describe how sieges could stretch across weeks or even months. Soldiers stationed outside the walls had to endure whatever weather the season delivered. Winter made the task especially demanding. The soldiers you see sleeping in the camp are not only keeping warm for comfort, they are preserving their strength for the long patience a siege requires. You imagine what life might look like during such a frozen standoff. Each morning the soldiers would wake stiff from the cold and gather near the fires for warmth. Guards would rotate along the perimeter while others checked the siege equipment or reinforced wooden barriers. The fortress walls would loom nearby, silent and watchful. Inside those walls, defenders would be facing the same winter cold. Two groups of soldiers separated by stone at distance, yet sharing the same frozen season. You glance again toward the distant fortress silhouette. Its towers rise dark against the stars, their shapes almost blending into the night sky. Somewhere within those walls other fires likely burn. Other soldiers likely sit wrapped in cloaks just as the ones around you do. Cold does not choose sides. One interesting detail occasionally mentioned in siege descriptions is that both attackers and defenders sometimes struggled equally with winter conditions. Frost could freeze ropes and wooden equipment, while snow made moving supplies slower and more difficult. In some cases, the weather became as powerful an opponent as the enemy army. You notice how carefully the camp around you has been arranged in response to this long waiting. Fires spaced across the field, tents gathered in clusters, snow walls and wagons forming quiet barriers against the wind. All of it designed not only for one night, but for many nights ahead. The soldiers sleeping here are settling into a rhythm that may continue for weeks. Scholars who examine a medieval siege warfare often discuss how maintaining morale and physical health during long winter encampments became a critical challenge for commanders. An army that froze or starved outside a fortress would never win its siege. So keeping soldiers warm, fed and rested became part of the strategy itself. You watch one of the guards walking slowly along the outer line of the camp again. His breath rises in small clouds as he moves between the wagons. Beyond him, the fortress remains silent. No torches flicker along its walls tonight. No horn sound from its towers, just the quiet tension of two forces enduring the same winter night. You lean closer to the embers and warm your hands once more. Even during a siege, warmth remains one of the simplest and most valuable comforts a soldier can find. Fires, cloaks, straw bedding, shared heat among companions. Each small solution helps soldiers survive the waiting. Across the camp, a horse shakes its mane gently, sending a few icy crystals scattering into the air. The animal lowers its head again and exhales slowly. Even the horses must endure the cold during these long encampments. Nearby, a sleeping soldier shifts beneath his cloak and presses closer to the warmth of a companion beside him. The small human details continue even in the shadow of war. You look once more toward the distant fortress. Its dark walls stand motionless against the stars. The siege will continue tomorrow, and the night after that. But for now, both sides simply wait. Winter stretches across the land like a silent referee between them. You settle deeper into your cloak and watch the camp around you resting beneath the cold sky. Another quiet night passes during the siege. Another night where warmth, patience and endurance matter just as much as swords or shields. The fortress remains a dark shape on the horizon as the night continues, but your thoughts drift away from the stillness of the siege and toward movement again. Not every winter campaign keeps an army in one place. Many soldiers must march through the cold crossing landscapes that seem determined to test every bit of their endurance. You imagine the camp at dawn breaking apart into motion, tents lowered, straw scattered, fires stamped out, wagons creaking back into line, and ahead of the army a frozen river stretching pale and wide beneath the winter sky. Few sights would have looked more inviting and more dangerous at the same time. Frozen rivers often became roads during medieval winters. When water hardened enough to bear weight, it offered armies a smoother route than muddy fields or snow-choked forest paths. Yet that convenience came with risk. Ice could crack currents beneath, could weaken certain patches, and men carrying armor or supplies had little room for graceful mistakes. You can almost hear it now, the brittle creak beneath boots, the nervous snort of horses, the grinding rumble of wagon wheels testing the frozen surface. Accounts preserved from winter campaigns make it clear that frozen waterways sometimes served as vital travel routes for armies, merchants, and messengers alike. In seasons when roads turned to mud or vanished beneath snow, the river itself could become the easiest path across the land. That did not make it safe. You picture yourself stepping from the snowy bank onto the ice. The surface is hard and pale, dusted with powdery snow that squeaks under your boots. Beneath that thin white coating lies a smooth sheet that reflects the moonlight in dull silver patches. Cold radiates upward immediately, different from the cold of earth, sharper somehow, as if the frozen water remembers what it used to be. A soldier ahead of you walks carefully, knees slightly bent, spear balanced across his shoulders. Another man behind him used the butt of a polearm to test the ice before each step. The entire column moves more slowly than usual. Nobody wants to be the one who discovers weak ice the memorable way. One small but fascinating detail that appears in a few Northern Campaign narratives is that soldiers sometimes spread straw brushwood or even discarded cloth over especially slippery sections of ice to give boots and wagon wheels a little more grip. The solution sounds almost comically simple: throw hay at the river and hope for the best. But practicality has never cared much about elegance. You can easily imagine how welcome that extra traction would feel. Leather soles and frozen surfaces make a miserable partnership. One careless slip could twist an ankle, drop a shield, or send a bundle of supplies skidding embarrassingly across the river, while your companions pretend not to laugh. Or perhaps they do laugh. Medieval soldiers were still people after all. The army moves carefully across the ice in your mind, cloaks drawn tight, breath rising in steady clouds. Horses pick their way with more caution than usual, their hooves making dull tapping sounds against the frozen surface. Wagon drivers mutter softly to their teams, keeping them calm. The cold in such moments must feel relentless. There is no campfire beside you, no settled shelter, only motion and the need to keep going. That is why clothing and preparation matter even more during a winter march. A soldier who stays warm in camp might still suffer badly on the road if his boots are damp, his gloves thin, or his cloak poorly wrapped against the wind sweeping across open ice. Records from medieval travel and warfare suggest that winter marches often demanded frequent halts, so men could restore feeling to their hands and feet, adjust foot wraps, and check the condition of animals and equipment. A moving army still had to pause. Cold forces its own schedule. You imagine the column finally reaching the far bank, boots crunching back onto snow. The relief would be immediate, even if the cold remained fierce. Solid ground feels safer than ice, and a patch of trees ahead might promise firewood and a little shelter from the wind. Still, the river crossing leaves its mark. Fingers stiffened, toes numbed, faces stung raw by air sweeping across the frozen surface. Researchers comparing medieval route records have reached different conclusions about how often armies deliberately chose frozen rivers over ordinary roads. In some regions, it appears to have been common winter practice, while in others, commanders may have avoided it unless no better option existed. The decision probably depended on local knowledge, how harsh the winter had been, how thick the ice looked, how desperate the army felt. You can understand all three. A shallow river frozen hard might look like a gift from heaven to an exhausted marching column. A broad, dark waterway with uncertain patches might look more like an argument with fate. Either way, soldiers had to adapt. You picture the men gathering on the far bank after the crossing. Some stamp their boots hard against the snow to restore circulation. Others rub their hands beneath their arms or pull cloaks tighter around their necks. One soldier crouches immediately to check a strap on his boot that loosened while crossing. Another brushes frost from his horse's mane. These small acts matter. The cold punishes neglect quickly. A less often discussed detail from winter travel writings is that some marching groups preferred to drink a few mouthfuls of cool water or weak ale after leaving the ice. Not because it warmed them, but because dry winter air and constant cold breathing left the throat painfully raw. Even discomfort comes in layers. Frozen toes, burning lungs, stiff fingers. And still the column moves on. You settle back beside the embers of the campfire, returning from the imagined march to the quiet field around you. The soldiers here sleep for now, but tomorrow or the next day many of them may be out on such a road crossing ice beneath a grey ski. That possibility hangs over every winter camp. Rest now. March later. Warmth borrowed from a few hours before the frozen world asks for endurance again. The embers glow softly at your side, and beyond them the dark land waits with its rivers, roads, and winter dangers. For medieval soldiers, staying warm was never only about surviving the night. It was also about being ready to keep moving when morning came. The imagined river crossing fades slowly from your thoughts, and once again you find yourself beside the quiet embers of the campfire. The field around you remains still beneath the cold scumdis gate. Most of the soldiers sleep deeply now, their cloaks wrapped tightly, as frost begins to gather along the edges of wagons and shields. Yet not everyone in the camp is asleep. You hear the soft clink of metal from somewhere behind the supply carts. A lantern glows faintly there, casting a small circle of yellow light across the ground. Inside that circle, several figures move quietly. Not soldiers this time. They are the people who travel with the army and help keep it functioning from day to day. Cooks, repairers, animal tenders, merchants carrying small goods. In the medieval world, these people formed an important part of many military camps. Armies rarely marched alone. Wherever soldiers went, a shadow community followed behind them, performing the countless tasks that allowed the army itself to survive. One man kneels beside a wooden crate and removes a bundle of cloth from inside. He examines it carefully before handing it to a soldier who sits nearby with his boots removed. The soldier wraps this cloth around his feet with practice movements. Fresh foot wraps. Even in the middle of the night, such small necessities matter. Many records from medieval campaigns describe how maintaining clothing and equipment required constant attention. Boots tore gloves, wore thin cloaks, absorbed snow and moisture. Without people to repair or replace these items, soldiers would quickly lose their protection against the cold. You watch as another camp follower sits beside a low lantern and threads a needle through a torn sleeve. His fingers move steadily despite the cold air. Stitch by stitch, he closes the gap in the wool. Nearby, a woman pours a small amount of warm liquid from a pot into a cup and hands it to a soldier who has just finished a watch shift. He accepts it gratefully and drinks slowly, letting the warmth spread through his chest. Small comfort appear everywhere in this quiet part of the camp. A curious detail sometimes mentioned in accounts of medieval armies is that certain camp followers became well known among the soldiers for particular skills. One person might be famous for repairing boots quickly, another for brewing strong broth, and another for mending cloaks with unusual speed. Their reputations travelled through the camp almost like legends. If a soldier's glove tore during a cold march, he might know exactly which person could fix it before nightfall. You glance around this lantern circle again and see evidence of those quiet skills everywhere. A saddle strap being tightened, a cloak seam being reinforced, a kettle being reheated for the next round of warm drink. All of it happening while most of the army sleeps. Modern historians examining medieval military logistics often emphasize how essential these helpers were for maintaining an army in the field. Feeding hundreds or thousands of soldiers, caring for animals, repairing equipment, and preparing supplies required far more labor than the soldiers alone could provide. Without that additional workforce, even well-armed armies would struggle to continue their campaigns. The soldiers nearby clearly understand this value. One man removes his glove and hands it to the repairer beside the lantern. The fingers of the glove have split along the seam. The repairer studies the damage briefly before nodding. A moment later, the needle moves again through thick wool. You notice how calm the entire scene feels. No one speaks loudly. The lantern light glows softly against the frost-covered ground. Even the horses nearby seem content standing quietly, while their breath drifts upward into the cold air. One of the camp followers walks slowly along the line of animals, checking the blankets draped across their backs. He adjusts one strap here, smooths a folded cloth there. These animals must remain healthy too. Without them, the army cannot move its wagons or carry its supplies. Researchers studying the organization of medieval armies still debate exactly how large these groups of camp followers might have been. Some historical sources suggest that large campaigns attracted hundreds of civilians, while others imply much smaller numbers depending on the region and the strictness of military leaders. The truth likely varies widely from one army to another. What remains clear is that their presence helps sustain the soldiers through long journeys and harsh weather. You watch as the repairer finishes stitching the torn glove and hands it back to its owner. The soldier pulls it on immediately and flexes his fingers with satisfaction. The warmth of whole clothing returns. Nearby the kettle releases another faint cloud of steam. Another cup of warm drink passes from hand to hand. Gradually the small group begins to quiet again as their tasks come to an end. The lantern is dimmed. Tools are packed away. The helpers wrap themselves in blankets just as the soldiers do. Soon the entire camp settles once more into silence. You lean closer to the embers and feel their fading warmth against your hands. Across the field the lantern glow disappears, and once again the medieval army sleeps beneath the cold winter stars, supported by the quiet work of the people who help keep them warm. The lantern that once glowed near the wagons has faded now, leaving the camp bathed only in the faint glow of embers and starlight. Frost sparkles along the edges of shields and saddle straps, forming delicate patterns that shimmer whenever a soldier shifts in sleep. For a while, the camp seems completely silent. Then from somewhere beyond the nearest tents, you hear a low voice. Not a shout, not an alarm, just a slow murmur that carries softly through the cold air. Someone is telling a story. You turn slightly and see a small cluster of soldiers sitting close to a surviving fire near the far edge of the camp. Most of the men around them sleep, but these few remain awake, wrapped in cloaks and leaning toward the warmth of the flames. Their voices stay quiet, almost careful not to disturb the rest of the camp. Stories help pass the night. In medieval armies, long evenings around the fire often became moments for shared tales, jokes, or songs. Soldiers waiting through cold nights and long campaigns relied on conversation to keep spirits from sinking too low. The body needs warmth, but the mind needs it too. You listen as the storyteller gestures slowly with one hand while the others lean closer to hear. The firelight flickers across their foreheads, revealing tired eyes and frost-tipped beard. His voice rises and falls gently as he describes something that happened during a march months earlier. Perhaps a battle. Perhaps a journey across distant hills. Perhaps a ridiculous mistake made by one of the men sitting beside him. Soft laughter spreads through the group. Not loud laughter, just the quiet kind that warms the chest. Accounts written by travellers moving with medieval armies sometimes mention how soldiers used storytelling and songs to maintain morale during long campaigns. When nights stretched for many hours and the cold seemed endless, shared stories offered distraction and companionship. A good story could make the hours pass more quickly. You watch as one of the soldiers adds another small piece of wood to the fire. The flames rise slightly, sending sparks into the air before settling again. The storyteller pauses to warm his hands. Then he continues. A curious little habit described in some medieval sources suggests that soldiers sometimes exaggerated their stories deliberately, turning ordinary events into dramatic adventures simply to entertain their companions. A simple march might become a tale of heroic survival. A clumsy fall might transform into a battle with invisible enemies. Accuracy mattered less than amusement. You can see that spirit here tonight. One of the listeners shakes his head in mock disbelief as the storyteller describes an encounter with a bear during a winter patrol. Another soldier quietly adds his own version of the story, causing the group to chuckle again. The cold seems slightly less powerful in moments like these. The firelight flickers brighter against their cloaks. The air feels warmer with shared laughter. Modern historians studying the social life of medieval soldiers often point out that these informal gatherings around the fire played an important role in maintaining group cohesion. Men who fought and marched together also needed moments to relax together. Stories created bonds, shared laughter built trust. Those bonds mattered later when battle arrived. You notice how the soldiers sit close together while listening. Their cloaks overlap slightly, creating a pocket of warmth within the circle. Even conversation contributes to warmth. Breath rises. Bodies lean toward the fire. The rhythm of speech keeps the mind alert. One soldier hums softly for a moment before beginning a quiet song. The tune moves slowly through the cold air, its melody simple and steady. The others listen in silence. Some close their eyes. Some stare into the flames. The song ends without applause, just a few quiet nods. Then the group begins to drift towards sleep as well. One man stretches his legs and lies back onto a bundle of straw. Another pulls his cloak around his shoulders and leans against a saddle. The storyteller himself finally wraps his cloak tighter and settles beside the fire. The embers glow softly beneath the remaining logs. Their warmth spreads gently through the small circle. You sit quietly and watch the group fade into stillness once more. The song lingers faintly in your mind even after the singer falls asleep. Beyond the fire, the rest of the camp remains silent beneath the winter sky. Horses breathe slowly. Guards continue their distant patrol, and above it all the stars shine with quiet clarity. In a place where warmth is precious and the cold presses constantly against every cloak and blanket, even a simple story becomes part of survival. Because sometimes warmth comes not only from fire or wool, sometimes it comes from shared voices in the night. The small circle of soldiers who shared stories near the fire has finally fallen silent. One by one they wrapped their cloaks tighter and drifted into sleep beside the glowing embers. The fire itself has become little more than a bed of dull red coals quietly breathing warmth into the frozen air. The camp rests again, but the cold continues its slow work. You feel it most clearly in the stillness. When the body stops moving for long stretches, the chill begins creeping inward again. Even beneath thick wool and layered clothing, the cold waits patiently. For medieval soldiers, the greatest danger during such nights was not always the enemy. Sometimes it was the body itself struggling against freezing temperatures. You shift slightly beneath your cloak and notice a soldier nearby rubbing his hands together even while half asleep. His fingers move automatically, encouraging warmth to return. It is a habit learned through experience. Long exposure to cold can slowly numb the extremities of the body. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses are especially vulnerable because blood circulation there can slow in harsh temperatures. When warmth fades too far, frost injury becomes a real possibility. Writings from various medieval campaigns occasionally describe soldiers waking during the night to restore feeling to their hands or feet. They would rub the skin vigorously, flex their fingers, or warm themselves briefly near a fire before returning to sleep. These small actions help prevent more serious problems. You notice another soldier doing something similar. He sits up slowly and pulls his boots closer to the embers, extending his feet toward the remaining heat. The leather darkens slightly as warmth returns to the material. After a few minutes, he lies back down again, satisfied that his toes are no longer numb. In many ways, the human body becomes a constant project during winter campaigns. Warm it, protect it, keep the blood moving. One unusual detail preserved in a few medical texts from the Middle Ages suggests that some people believed rubbing snow directly on cold skin could help restore circulation. The idea may sound surprising today, but the sensation of cold stimulation sometimes did encourage blood flow to return. Whether it truly helped or simply made the situation more uncomfortable probably depended on the circumstances. What matters is that people searched for ways to protect their bodies from the cold. You glance toward the sleeping soldiers again and notice how many have tucked their hands beneath their arms or inside their cloaks. This simple position traps warmth against the chest where body heat remains strongest. The technique appears everywhere in the camp. Even in sleep, the soldiers guard their warmth. Modern scholars examining historical medical knowledge often note that people in the medieval world understood basic cold protection through observation and practical experience. They may not have known the scientific language of circulation or tissue damage, but they clearly recognized the warning signs of excessive cold. Numb fingers, pale skin, stiff movement. When those signs appeared, soldiers reacted quickly. Movement reminded warmth. Fire restored feeling. Dry clothing preserved heat. You watch as a guard walking along the camp edge pauses beside a small fire and extends his hands toward the embers. After a moment, he rubs his fingers together vigorously before continuing his patrol. Even short pauses can help. The night air feels sharper now than earlier in the evening. Frost spreads slowly across the field, touching the edges of straw bedding and tent ropes. A horse nearby snorts softly and stamps one hoof against the frozen ground. Animals feel the cold too. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and breathe slowly. The warmth trapped beneath the wool spreads gently through your chest. Around you, the camp remains peaceful. Most of the soldiers sleep without disturbance. Yet here and there, small movements continue. A man flexing his toes inside his boots, another adjusting his cloak over his ears, a third pulling a blanket higher around his shoulders. Each motion protects the body from the creeping cold. Historians who study medieval military life sometimes reflect on how much endurance winter demanded from soldiers. Without modern heating or insulated clothing, survival depended heavily on awareness and routine. Warm clothing alone was not enough. A soldier had to remain attentive to his own comfort and health throughout the night. You look once more across the quiet camp. Fires glow faintly. Cloaked figures rest beneath the stars. Occasional movements ripple through the stillness as someone shifts position or warms cold hands. The battle against winter continues quietly through these small acts. And for now, the soldiers hold their ground against the cold. The night continues its slow, quiet rhythm across the frozen camp. Most soldiers remain wrapped tightly in cloaks and blankets, their shapes barely visible beneath the pale glow of the stars. The fires have settled into small islands of ember, light, casting gentle shadows across helmets and wagon wheels. You sit quietly beside one of those fading fires and begin noticing something subtle about the sleeping arrangements around you. Not every soldier sleeps in exactly the same conditions. Some bedding areas appear thicker with extra blankets or fur layered above the straw. A few tents nearby seem slightly larger and more carefully arranged than the others. Even the horses tied beside them look better groomed. These details reveal something that existed in every medieval army. Rank. Armies during the Middle Ages were not uniform groups where everyone possessed the same equipment. Knights, officers, and wealthier warriors often travelled with better gear and more resources than ordinary foot soldiers. That difference sometimes became visible even during cold winter nights. Documents from medieval campaigns show that knights frequently carried heavier cloaks, fur-lined garments, and more elaborate tents than the average infantryman. Their higher status allowed them to afford thicker fabrics and additional supplies. Fur linings in particular provided remarkable insulation. You glance toward one such tent standing slightly apart from the others. Its canvas appears thicker and a fur blanket hangs across the entrance flap like a curtain. Inside, two figures sleep on bedding that looks far more comfortable than the straw bundles scattered across the rest of the camp. Even the fire near their tent burns a little stronger. Yet despite these advantages, the difference may not be as large as it first appears. The cold does not respect titles. A knight wearing expensive fur still feels the freezing air of winter just as sharply as the soldier beside him. You notice that even the well-equipped men rely on many of the same strategies used by everyone else. Straw beneath them, cloaks wrapped tightly, boots placed near the fire to dry. The basics remain universal. One interesting detail sometimes mentioned in medieval household records is that fur from animals such as fox, rabbit, or squirrel was commonly used to line cloaks and blankets. These furs trapped heat extremely well, making them valuable additions to winter clothing. For soldiers who could afford them, fur linings offered a noticeable improvement in warmth. You see evidence of that now in the cloak worn by a man sitting near the larger tent. The inside of his collar shows a narrow strip of pale fur that catches the firelight softly. He pulls the cloak closer around his neck and leans toward the warmth of the flames. Across the camp, an infantry soldier lies wrapped only in thick wool. His bedding consists of straw and a single blanket. Yet he sleeps just as peacefully. Warmth does not always require luxury. It requires knowledge. Many modern historians examining medieval armies point out that while differences in equipment existed between ranks, the harsh realities of campaigning often narrowed those gaps during long marches or sieges. Even well-equipped knights faced the same weather, the same ground, and the same cold nights as their companions. Under such conditions, practical survival methods mattered more than wealth. You watch a knight squire approach the tent carrying a small bundle of firewood. He places the wood carefully beside the fire before brushing frost from the edge of the tent flap. The act seems routine, yet it reveals another difference between ranks. Higher status warriors often travelled with assistants who helped manage their equipment and supplies. That extra pair of hands could make life in the camp slightly easier. Still, the knight himself remains inside the tent, wrapped in cloak and blanket like everyone else. The winter night surrounds him just as surely. You stretch your legs slightly and look back across the camp. Rows of sleeping figures lie scattered among wagons and tents. Some cloaks show signs of fine tailoring. Others bear patches and repairs. Yet beneath all those differences, the soldiers share the same goal. Stay warm. Survive the night. Be ready when morning comes. A horse shifts its weight nearby, causing the harness rings to jingle softly. The sound echoes faintly across the quiet camp. You notice that even the animals tied beside the larger tents are covered with thicker blankets. Care for animals also reflects status and resources. Yet once again, the cold treats them all equally. Frost gathers along the edges of saddles and straps, no matter who owns them. You settle deeper into your cloak and let your eyes follow the soft glow of embers across the field. Some soldiers sleep beneath fur, some beneath plain wool, some beneath nothing more than patched blankets. But every one of them lies beneath the same winter sky. And tonight rank matters far less than the shared struggle to stay warm. The quiet of the camp stretches on as the cold night deepens. The fires have sunk even lower, glowing like scattered red eyes across the field. Soldiers remain wrapped in cloaks, their shapes rising and falling slowly with sleep. Frost thickens on wagon wheels and leather straps, giving the entire camp a faint silvery shimmer. As you sit beside the fading embers, your thoughts begin to wander beyond this single camp. Not every medieval soldier faced winter in exactly the same way. Across Europe, the landscape changed dramatically from region to region. Mountains, forests, open plains, and frozen northern coasts each presented their own challenges during the cold months. Soldiers learned to adapt to the climates they marched through. In the colder northern regions of Europe, warriors often relied on heavier wool garments and thicker fur linings. Long winters in places such as Scandinavia or the Baltic lands forced people to develop clothing designed specifically for harsh temperatures. Layers became even more important there. Historical descriptions from travellers moving through northern territories frequently mention garments made from multiple layers of wool and fur. These materials trapped warmth efficiently and protected the wearer from biting winds blowing across frozen landscapes. You can imagine a soldier from those lands standing comfortably in conditions that might leave others shivering. The cloak he wears may be heavier, the boots may include extra lining, even the gloves might be thicker than those worn farther south. In contrast, soldiers from milder regions often relied more heavily on layered wool clothing without thick fur. Winters in parts of southern Europe could still be cold, but they rarely reached the extreme temperatures of the far north. This difference shaped how armies prepared for campaigns. One interesting practice occasionally noted in accounts from northern Europe involved soldiers wearing long woolen caps that could be pulled down to cover the ears and part of the neck. These caps were simple but extremely effective against cold winds. You picture a line of soldiers marching through snow with those caps pulled low, their faces barely visible beneath layers of cloth. The design may not look impressive, but it protects some of the most sensitive areas of the body from freezing air. Across the camp around you, a few soldiers already sleep with their hoods pulled tightly over their heads in a similar fashion. Different regions often arrived at similar solutions. Modern researchers studying medieval clothing traditions often compare garments from different parts of Europe to understand how people adapted to local climates. The evidence suggests that northern communities tended to develop heavier outer garments while southern regions emphasized layering lighter materials. Yet when armies marched far from home, these traditions often mixed together. A soldier from a colder region might share techniques with companions from warmer lands. You imagine conversations around earlier campfires where men compared their clothing and methods for staying warm. Someone explaining how to wrap a cloak more tightly, another showing how to stuff extra wool inside a boot. Small pieces of knowledge spreading quietly through the ranks. One curious detail sometimes mentioned in old chronicles is that soldiers occasionally traded pieces of clothing among themselves during particularly cold campaigns. A man with extra wool might exchange it for food or tools, while someone with a spare fur collar might pass it to a companion whose cloak had worn thin. Practical needs often outweighed personal pride. You glance again at the sleeping soldiers around you. Some cloaks appear heavier, others thinner. A few show the distinctive texture of fur along the collar or cuffs. These differences reflect the diverse backgrounds of the men in the camp. Each soldier brings his own experiences from home. Together they create a small collection of winter survival techniques gathered from many places. Researchers examining medieval armies often remark that such exchanges of knowledge helped soldiers adapt quickly when facing unfamiliar climates. An army marching north for the first time might learn valuable lessons from local recruits or mercenaries already accustomed to harsher winters. Over time, those lessons became shared wisdom. You notice a soldier near the edge of the camp adjusting his hood carefully around his ears before settling back to sleep. Perhaps he learned that habit at home, or perhaps someone showed him earlier in the campaign. Either way, the result is the same: better protection against the cold. The wind drifts lightly across the camp again, brushing the edges of cloaks and tents. Yet the soldiers remain mostly undisturbed. Their layers hold. Their knowledge protects them. You stretch your hands toward the last warmth of the embers and look across the quiet field. Different lands, different winters, different traditions of clothing and survival. But tonight, all those methods gather together in one place. A medieval army resting beneath the same cold sky, each soldier carrying a piece of winter wisdom learned somewhere far away. The cold night continues its slow, quiet watch over the camp. Frost now coats the edges of nearly everything. Wagon wheels wear thin silver rims. Leather straps glisten faintly. Even the straw scattered across the ground sparkles like pale glass beneath the starlight. You pull your cloak a little tighter and notice again how much warmth that single garment provides. Wool truly is the quiet hero of this winter camp. Nearly every soldier around you relies on it in some form. Cloaks, blankets, tunics and foot wraps all share the same familiar texture. The fabric feels thick and slightly rough, yet the moment it surrounds your body, the difference becomes obvious. The cold retreats a little. Warm air remains trapped close to the skin. Wool has remarkable qualities that medieval people understood through experience long before modern science explained them. The fibers of wool naturally crimp and curl, creating tiny pockets where air becomes trapped. Those pockets hold warmth, forming a layer of insulation between the body and the freezing air. Even when wool becomes slightly damp, it continues to insulate. This property made it one of the most valuable materials available to soldiers travelling through cold climates. Records preserved from medieval trade and taxation systems show that wool was one of the most widely produced textiles in Europe. Entire regions raised sheep specifically to support the growing demand for wool clothing and blankets. Armies benefited directly from that trade. The cloaks wrapped around the sleeping soldiers tonight likely began their journey in distant pastures, where sheep grazed months or even years earlier. You glance toward a soldier lying near the fire and notice how thick his cloak appears. The folds of wool bunch together around his shoulders like layers of protective armor. He barely moves in his sleep. The warmth holds him comfortably in place. One curious observation occasionally mentioned in historical descriptions of wool garments is that some cloaks were intentionally woven slightly oversized so that the wearer could wrap them fully around the body during cold weather. The extra fabric created a kind of portable shelter. A soldier might sit beside a fire, draw the cloak over his head and shoulders, and form a small pocket of warmth beneath it. You can imagine doing exactly that now. The cloak draped over your head, the warmth of your own breath slowly heating the air beneath the wool. Outside the fabric, the cold continues its quiet work. Inside the cloak, the air grows gentle and still. Across the camp, you see several soldiers sleeping in precisely that position. Their cloaks cover them completely, leaving only boots or helmet edges visible beneath the folds. They resemble dark woolen bundles resting on the frost-covered ground. Researchers who study medieval textiles often point out that wool remained dominant for everyday clothing because of its durability as well as its warmth. Wool fibers resist wear and tearing far better than many other fabrics available during the period. For soldiers travelling through forests, fields and muddy roads, that durability proved essential. Clothing had to survive months of rough use. You watch as a guard walking near the outer edge of the camp pauses briefly and adjusts the collar of his wool cloak. Even while moving through the cold air, that cloak provides a dependable shield. The guard pulls the fabric closer around his neck before continuing his slow patrol. Another soldier nearby shifts slightly in his sleep and tucks his hands deeper beneath the folds of his cloak. The movement is almost instinctive. Where wool gathers, warmth remains. You notice how the firelight reflects softly against the texture of the fabric. The wool absorbs the glow rather than reflecting it brightly. A quiet warmth, not flashy, just dependable. Modern historians examining the everyday equipment of medieval soldiers often remark that while armor and weapons receive much attention, the humble wool cloak may have been just as essential for survival during long campaigns. Without it, soldiers would face freezing nights with little protection. Wool allowed them to endure weather that might otherwise have driven armies back toward warmer homes. You reach out and touch the fabric, again feeling the thick weave beneath your fingers. Each thread holds a tiny space of air. Thousands of those spaces gather warmth. The science may be simple, but the effect is powerful. Across the camp, the cloaked figures remain still protected by the same material woven from sheep raised far away. The night continues to press its cold breath against the camp, yet the wool holds firm. You lean closer to the embers and pull the cloak tighter around your shoulders. In this frozen world of steel, leather and frost, the soft strength of wool quietly keeps medieval soldiers alive through another winter night. The embers beside you glow faintly. Their warmth softer now, but still welcome against the chill that has settled across the camp. Most of the soldiers remain asleep, their cloaks pulled close while frost continues to form along the edges of tents and wagons. The stars overhead seem almost sharper, as the night deepens like distant crystals scattered across the sky. Even in this quiet moment, the cold feels determined. Winter demands endurance. You begin thinking about how soldiers prepared for nights like this long before they ever reached the battlefield. Many armies did not simply encounter winter conditions by accident. In certain regions, commanders understood that their troops needed to grow accustomed to harsh weather if they hoped to fight effectively during the colder months. Preparation became part of training. Some chronicles describing military life mention that soldiers in colder parts of Europe often drilled or marched during winter rather than avoiding the season entirely. The goal was not to punish the men, but to ensure that they understood how their bodies reacted to freezing air, heavy snow, and long nights. Experience was a powerful teacher. A soldier who'd marched through winter storms before would know how to wrap his cloak properly, how to dry his boots near the fire, and how to keep his fingers moving when the cold began to creep in. You imagine a group of recruits standing on a snowy field months earlier, stamping their feet while an experienced veteran demonstrates how to secure foot wraps tightly around the ankles. Another soldier shows them how to fold a cloak so it traps warmth around the shoulders. Small lessons, yet lessons that might one day mean the difference between comfort and misery during a campaign. One curious detail mentioned in several accounts of medieval military life suggests that some commanders deliberately held exercises during cold weather to test the resilience of their troops. The idea was so simple. If soldiers could remain disciplined in freezing wind, they would perform even better in milder conditions. You can almost hear the sounds of such training now, boots crunching through fresh snow, shields knocking softly together as men adjust their positions. A commander's voice calling instructions across the cold field. The soldiers breathe heavily, their breath forming clouds that drift upward into the winter air. Their cloaks and tunics move stiffly with frost, yet they continue the drills. Researchers studying the development of medieval military practices sometimes note that repeated exposure to harsh weather likely improved a soldier's ability to manage cold conditions later during real campaigns. People adapt. Bodies learn. What first feels unbearable may become merely uncomfortable after enough experience. You notice how that principle appears in the camp around you tonight. The soldiers sleeping beside the fires have already learned the routines that help them endure the cold. Boots placed near warmth, hands tucked beneath cloaks, straw gathered beneath their bedding. None of these habits appear dramatic, yet together they represent knowledge earned through long exposure to winter conditions. Across the camp, one guard pauses during his patrol and rolls his shoulders slowly before continuing. Even small movements keep the body warm. That guard likely practiced such habits long before tonight. Another soldier shifts slightly in his sleep and pulls his cloak tighter around his neck. The motion seems automatic. Experience has taught him how to protect himself even while resting. A lesser-known detail from medieval training traditions suggests that veteran soldiers sometimes advised younger recruits to sleep in their clothing during winter campaigns rather than removing laces for comfort. Clothing preserved warmth and allowed a soldier to rise quickly if danger appeared. Practical advice passed from one generation to the next. You look across the camp once more. These men are not simply enduring the cold. They are applying skills learned over years of marching and fighting. Modern historians examining the lives of medieval soldiers often point out that endurance was one of the most valuable qualities a warrior could possess. Battles might last hours. Campaigns might last months. Winter nights like this one tested patience as much as strength. A soldier who understood how to manage the cold had a clear advantage. You settle deeper into your cloak and watch the frost shimmer along the ground. The camp remains peaceful, yet beneath that calm lies a quiet readiness built through experience and training. The soldiers sleep, but their knowledge remains with them. Layered clothing, careful routines, hard lessons learned during earlier winters. And through those lessons, they find the strength to endure another frozen night beneath the medieval sky. The camp rests in a deep stillness now. Even the guards seem quieter as they move along the edges of the wagons and tents. The fires have settled into faint circles of red light, and the frost that formed earlier now coats the ground in a thin white layer. You look up at the sky. The stars remain bright and steady, but something else has begun to change. The darkness has softened, It is almost impossible to notice at first. The eastern edge of the horizon carries the faintest hint of pale grey, where the black sky once stretched without interruption. Dawn is still far away, yet the night has reached its coldest moment. Many people who have spent time outdoors in winter know this feeling well. The hours just before sunrise often bring the lowest temperatures of the entire night. Whatever warmth lingered after sunset has long since vanished. The earth has been losing heat steadily for hours. This is the moment when the cold presses hardest against every cloak and blanket. You feel it now as you pull your wool garment tighter around your shoulders. The air bites slightly at your nose and ears. Even the horses seem aware of the change. One of them snorts softly and shifts its weight, stamping a hoof against the frozen ground. Nearby, a soldier stirs beneath his blanket and draws his cloak higher over his face. Instinct. Sleep grows lighter during these last cold hours. Several medieval chronicles describing life on campaign make brief mention of how soldiers often woke or shifted position just before dawn during winter encampments. The drop in temperature could disturb even the deepest sleep. Many men would take the opportunity to move closer to the fire or adjust their bedding. You see exactly that happening now. A soldier near the embers sits up slowly and extends his hands toward the faint warmth of the coals. He rubs his fingers together until the feeling returns before lying back down again. Another man rolls toward a companion, pressing shoulder against shoulder beneath a shared blanket. Body heat becomes especially valuable now. You glance toward the guards again. One stands beside a wagon with his cloak wrapped tightly around his neck. His breath rises in steady clouds while he shifts his feet to keep circulation moving. Even experienced soldiers feel the cold during this hour. One curious note preserved in a few travel accounts suggests that some winter watchmen would hum or whisper quietly to themselves during the coldest parts of the night. Not for entertainment, simply to remain alert and awake while the cold tried to dull their senses. A faint murmur carries through the still air as one of the guards does exactly that. The sound blends gently with the quiet crackle of the embers. Across the camp, a small movement catches your attention. One of the camp followers rises from beneath a blanket and crouches beside a kettle near the button. Soon a few sparks leap from the coals as he stirs them back to life. Morning preparations have begun. Even before sunrise, someone must begin warming water and preparing food. Researchers who study the routines of medieval armies often remark that activity in camp frequently resumed before dawn. Soldiers needed time to eat pack equipment and prepare for the day's march or duties. Cold mornings demanded even more preparation. Warm food, hot drink, dry clothing. You notice the faint glow of the revived fire growing slightly stronger near the wagons. The camp follower adds a few thin sticks of wood and blows gently until a small flame appears. Steam begins rising from the kettle almost immediately. The promise of warmth spreads quietly through the camp. A few soldiers stir in their bedding as the smell of smoke drifts across the field. The sky above continues its slow transformation. The eastern horizon now carries a pale silver line that grows wider by the minute. Night is loosening its grip. The cold remains sharp, but the knowledge that morning is approaching seems to lift the mood of the camp. Another soldier sits up and stretches his arms, his joints stiff from hours of sleep on the ground. He reaches toward the fire before pulling his boots closer to the coals. Others begin shifting beneath their blankets. Some sit upright. Some rub their hands together. Some simply wait, watching the sky grow brighter. You remain seated beside the embers and watch the slow awakening unfold. The hardest part of the night is ending. Soon the fires will burn brighter. Soon voices will return. Soon the frost-covered camp will transform into a busy place once again. But for this final quiet moment before sunrise, the medieval soldiers savour the last calm breaths of the winter night. The pale silver line along the horizon grows slowly brighter. It stretches wider across the eastern sky, gently pushing the darkness back. Around you, the frost-covered camp begins to stir as the first hints of morning touch the frozen ground. The cold remains sharp, yet something about the coming light makes it feel easier to endure. One of the fires near the wagons crackles more strongly now as fresh wood is added. Sparks rise upward and vanish into the fading night. The kettle that was placed over the flamer layer releases a thin ribbon of steam. The smell of warming broth drifts quietly across the camp. You hear the first clear, sound of a soldier waking nearby. He shifts beneath his cloak, stretches stiff arms above his head, and slowly sits upright. His breath rises in pale clouds while he rubs his hands together. Another soldier beside him pulls his blanket away and swings his boots onto the frosted ground. Morning has begun. Across the field, more men start to move. Some kneel beside the fires to warm their fingers. Others shake frost from their cloaks or brush snow from the edges of their bedding. The camp that seemed frozen in silence only minutes ago begins filling with quiet activity. The routines of survival continue. Accounts preserved from medieval campaigns frequently describe how soldiers began their mornings by restoring warmth to their bodies before attempting any serious work. Hands were warmed near the fire, stiff joints were stretched, and boots were checked carefully before marching. Cold nights demanded slow awakenings. You watch as one soldier lifts his boots closer to the flames and turns them gently so the leather softens again after hours of frost. Another pours a small cup of hot liquid from the kettle and drinks it carefully, letting the warmth spread through his chest. The first rays of sunlight begin to appear along the horizon, now touching the upper edges of the clouds with faint gold. Light reveals the full shape of the camp. Rows of tents, wagons arranged in careful lines, horses shaking frost from their manes, soldiers wrapped in wool cloaks moving slowly through the cold air. One lesser-known observation recorded in travel writings from the Middle Ages suggests that winter mornings in military camps often began with a quiet sense of relief. The simple fact that the night had passed safely meant that men could begin the day with renewed energy. Surviving the cold was its own small victory. You feel that same quiet satisfaction now as the sky grows brighter. The fires burn steadily. Steam rises from kettles. The frost sparkles across the ground like scattered crystals. Across the camp, a soldier laughs softly at something his companion says while they warm their hands beside the fire. Laughter sounds different in the morning, less tired, more hopeful. Scholars who study the daily life of medieval soldiers often reflect on how much resilience these men required simply to endure the environment around them. Battles and campaigns demanded strength, but so did the ordinary struggle of living outdoors through harsh seasons. Each winter night required patience, knowledge, and cooperation. Warm clothing, shared fires, careful routines passed from one soldier to another. All of these small things helped armies survive conditions that might otherwise have defeated them. You watch as the sun finally begins to lift above the horizon. Its light spreads slowly across the field, touching tents and shield and the frost-covered ground. The temperature will remain cold for some time yet, but daylight brings movement. Men gather their equipment. Straw bedding is shaken free of frost. Cloaks are tightened around shoulders as soldiers prepare for the day. The quiet night camp transforms into a living army once again. You take one last look across the field. Where only darkness and embers existed hours earlier, there are now voices, footsteps, and the glow of morning fires. The soldiers have endured another winter night. They stayed warm with wool and straw, with fire and shared shelter, with simple tricks learned through experience. And as the rising sun begins to chase away the frost, the camp breathes a little easier. The long, frozen night has passed. Now the day begins. As the camp wakes fully beneath the soft gold of the morning sun, you allow the scene to fade gently in your mind. The fires burn brighter. The soldiers gather their gear. Horses shake the frost from their coats while the first warm food of the day is passed from hand to hand. Yet the quiet lessons of the night remain. Through wool cloaks, shared warmth, careful fires, and the steady patience of experienced medieval soldiers found ways to endure winter's hardest hours. Not with grand endurance, but with simple knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Now the sky grows brighter above the camp, and the cold night finally loosens its hold on the frozen field. You can almost feel the warmth of the coming day reaching slowly across the land. So let the sounds of that distant camp fade softly away. The crackle of the fire, the quiet movement of soldiers, the slow breath of horses beneath the morning sky. And as the light grows brighter and the story settles gently into stillness, allow yourself to drift peacefully towards sleep. The winter night has ended, the soldiers are warm again, and the world grows calm beneath the rising sun. Sweet dreams.